The history of the Pokemon world did not begin with a single trainer stepping out the door of a small house, blinking into the morning light. It began long before that, in a time when the continents had different shapes and the seas were quiet with creatures no living person had ever named. There are records hidden inside the games themselves, pressed into stone tablets and ancient murals, and the faded entries of researchers who spent lifetimes trying to understand what they were looking at. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Every generation of these games carries a piece of a much larger picture, and when you lay them all side by side, something extraordinary begins to emerge. The beginning of everything in the Pokemon universe is attributed to a single entity whose existence predates space, time, and even the concept of matter itself. Arceus, known in ancient tablets as the Original One, emerged from a great void and shaped the world through the power of 1,000 arms. These arms are represented in its body as the rings that encircle it, rings that resonate with a kind of energy older than any mountain or ocean. The Sinnoh region holds the most complete record of this creation. Carved into stone deep inside Spear Pillar, a sacred and windswept place at the peak of Mount Coronet, those carvings describe a world that did not simply appear, but was carefully constructed, piece by piece, by a being of unfathomable will. Before Arceus shaped the world in any recognizable form, there was only a churning, undifferentiated chaos. From within that chaos, Arceus brought three abstract entities into existence. The first two were Dialga and Palkia, beings that would govern time and space respectively. Dialga carries within it the power to control the flow of time in all directions. Palkia holds dominion over the structure of physical space and the boundaries between parallel dimensions. Their birth from Arceus was not a gentle event. The Sinnoh myths describe it as the establishment of the two great axes around which all subsequent existence would be organized. Time would move forward. Space would have depth and dimension. These were not merely gifts to the world. They were the conditions that made a world possible at all. A third deity emerged alongside them, though its nature was fundamentally different. Giratina was born with the same raw power as its siblings, but its temperament was violent in a way that the young universe could not easily accommodate. The ancient texts do not paint Giratina as simply evil. They describe a being whose energy was necessary, but disruptive, a force that could not exist in the same space as the world being built without tearing it apart. Arceus sent Giratina away, not as punishment in the human sense of the word, but as a necessary arrangement. Giratina was given its own realm, a mirror dimension existing alongside the primary world, a place where the rules of gravity and dimension were inverted and strange. That realm would come to be known as the Distortion World, and Giratina became its sole sovereign, watching the primary world from behind a veil that most living things would never perceive. With time and space established, Arceus turned toward the next layer of creation. Three beings emerged from the first ripples of the newly formed world, entities that would govern the forces of knowledge, emotion, and willpower. These were Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, collectively known as the Lake Guardians. Uxie settled into the cold, clear waters of Lake Acuity, bringing with it the gift of knowledge and the wisdom to use it carefully. Mesprit descended into Lake Verity, and with it came the capacity to feel, the first stirring of emotion in any living thing. Azelf came to rest in Lake Valor, carrying within it the spark of determination and the will to act. The Sinnoh myths suggest that without these three, life could exist in a purely mechanical sense, but would lack any of the inner qualities that make existence meaningful. Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf were the reason that creatures and eventually people would be more than simple automatons moving through a physical world. Around this same period of cosmic formation, two more immense forces were given shape. Groudon and Kyogre, known in Hoenn's oldest records as primal beings of land and sea, emerged in an age when the world's continents and oceans were still being decided. These were not quiet, contemplative creatures. They were enormous, elemental, and almost immediately locked in a conflict that shaped the geography of the known world. Groudon dragged land up from beneath the seas, expanding the continents outward with a force that could be felt across the entire globe. Kyogre drove the seas deeper and wider, filling the basins that Groudon created with water that fell in great curtains from skies turned heavy with cloud. Their battle was long and exhausting, and the land and water of the world reflect that struggle in every coastline and mountain range. The creature that eventually separated them was Rayquaza, the great sky serpent who had lived in the upper atmosphere since before Groudon and Kyogre had taken their current forms. Rayquaza feeds on the particles and meteorites that drift through the high atmosphere, and it has circled the world from above for longer than most ancient texts can account for. When the conflict between Groudon and Kyogre threatened to destroy everything below, Rayquaza descended from the sky in a display of power that silenced both of them. Its appearance ended the primal age of that conflict. Groudon retreated into the magma beneath the earth, falling into a sleep measured in geological ages. Kyogre sank to the deepest trench of the ocean and rested there in a stillness that the sea above never fully reflected. What the world looked like in the quiet that followed this age of primal conflict is difficult to know precisely. The land masses existed, the oceans were filled, but the world was still extraordinarily empty by any later standard. The Pokémon that would eventually populate forests and mountains and shorelines were still in their earliest forms, and human civilization had not yet appeared in any organized sense. This was the deepest past the games describe, a time so remote that its events are preserved only in stone and in the memory of creatures that do not easily communicate what they carry. The next layer of creation moved towards something more specific. In the Johto region, a different myth describes the emergence of three legendary beasts from a fire that consumed a great tower long before any living person's memory. The Brass Tower and the Burned Tower stand in Ecruteak City as monuments to an event that the people of Johto remember as a catastrophe, but which the ancient records suggest was also a transformation. Three unnamed Pokémon perished in the fire that destroyed one of those towers, and Ho-Oh, who had been watching over the world from its perch in the sky above, descended and breathed new life into their charred forms. From that fire, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune emerged with the qualities of lightning, flame, and water woven into their bodies. They ran from the towers and scattered across the land, and they have been moving ever since, restless in the way that creatures are who carry within them the memory of something that ended and then began again. Ho-Oh itself is one of the most ancient presences in the Pokemon world. Its feathers carry prismatic color, and the old text describes seeing it as an experience that brings happiness to those who are fortunate enough to witness its passage across the sky. Ho-Oh does not stay in any one place. It circles the world at high altitude, much as Rayquaza does, but where Rayquaza watches over the atmospheric boundary, Ho-Oh watches over the emotional register of the world below. The rainbow wing that it sometimes sheds is a relic of extraordinary rarity, and its significance in the Johto myths speaks to the idea that certain objects can carry spiritual weight far beyond their physical form. Lugia occupies the counterpart position in Johto's mythology, a being of such power that the sea itself responds to its movements. The ancient records describe Lugia as the guardian of the seas, a creature so massive and so capable of disruption that it withdrew to the deepest underwater caverns to protect the world from the effects of its own presence. When it spreads its wings, storms form. When it moves through the water, waves rise far from any coast. Lugia's retreat was not an act of weakness, but of responsibility, a recognition that containing one's power is sometimes more difficult and more important than expressing it. The relationship between Ho-Oh and Lugia is not explicitly a conflict in the way that Groudon and Kyogre's relationship was defined by opposition. They represent complementary forces, sky and sea, fire and water, the burning brightness of noon, and the silver quiet of deep ocean. The Johto myths suggest that their balance is not something that was established once and holds automatically, but something that requires ongoing attention and care, a balance maintained across the long arc of time by creatures who have been present since almost the beginning. As the world settled into its basic form, smaller but still enormously significant forces began to take shape at specific locations. The Rigi golems, Regirock, Regis, and Registeel were constructed or perhaps condensed from the pure elemental forces of their respective materials during a very ancient period. Their exact origin is not fully explained in any single game's lore. What the myths suggest is that a civilization of great power created them as guardian figures, embedding within them a depth of awareness that does not express itself in any way recognizable to ordinary observers. They respond to specific signals. They defend specific places. And they have been doing so for so long that the civilization which built them has been entirely forgotten, leaving only these three immense presences standing in sealed chambers waiting. The Regis were eventually joined by two additional members of what the myths describe as a related family, Regigigas, enormously vast and possessed of a strength that the ancient records describe as sufficient to move entire continents, is the progenitor of the original three. It exists in a state of almost perpetual sleep, kept dormant by the other Regis simply because the power it contains could not be easily contained otherwise. Regidrago and Regileki, discovered in later exploration of an area called the Crown Tundra, suggest that the ancient civilization that created the original Regis had broader ambitions than the records initially indicated, building creatures from dragon energy and from concentrated electrical force that represent ideas about power and control that the passage of time had. Largely buried, the first human civilizations in the Pokemon world emerged gradually, and their relationship with Pokemon was immediate and defining from the very beginning. The oldest evidence of organized human society in these games appears in fragments distributed across multiple regions, none of which tells the complete story. The ruins of Alph in Johto contain Unown, a species of Pokemon whose forms correspond directly to letters of an ancient written language. Whether human writing developed to mirror the shapes of Unown, or whether Unown took on the shapes of human letters, is a question the games raise without resolving, and that ambiguity is itself meaningful. It suggests a relationship between early humans and these creatures that was so deep and so fundamental that the two became reflections of each other. The ancient civilization of the Cianwood and Ecritake area in Johto left records that speak to a time when the connection between people and Pokemon was more direct and less mediated than it would later become. The Kimono girls who maintain the old traditions of that region carry a cultural memory that stretches back to this period, preserving in their dances and ceremonies a relationship with the legendary Pokemon of the land that has been tended carefully for many generations. The significance of Ecritake as a cultural and spiritual center of the Pokemon world is something that emerges gradually the more time one spends reading between the lines of what the games offer. In the Kanto region, the deepest traces of ancient civilization appear in the form of a great structure that no longer stands in its original form, but whose influence ripples forward through time. Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town is one resting place of this memory, but the deeper history is embedded in the fact that certain Kanto locations feel impossibly old, as though the ground itself remembers things that the people living above it have long since set aside. Mount Moon holds fossils of Pokemon from an era so distant that even the researchers who study them cannot fully account for the ecological conditions that would have produced them. Dome Fossil and Helix Fossil speak to living things of extraordinary antiquity, and the fact that science eventually learned to restore life from those stones is one of the most quietly remarkable details in the entire framework of these games. The Hoenn region carries a different and particularly rich layer of ancient history. The people of Hoenn were profoundly shaped by their proximity to the sea, and the oldest legends of that region describe a time when the relationship between land and water was not the settled arrangement it would later become. The Sea Moville and the Cave of Origin and the Sky Pillar all carry traces of a civilization that understood, at some level, the cosmological forces at work beneath the comfortable surface of daily life. The Cave of Origin, in particular, stands as a place where the membrane between ordinary existence and something much older feels genuinely thin. It is where Groudon and Kyogre can be reached even in the present day of the game's events, which suggests that the deep past is never entirely past in the Pokemon world. It continues, just beneath the surface, waiting for conditions to reassert itself. The civilization of ancient Hoenn left behind the legend of the Devon Corporation's predecessor, a culture that worked with stone and sea and fire in ways that modern researchers are still piecing together. The Mirage Island myths, the stories of ancient Pokemon that appear only under specific celestial conditions, and the entire framework of the primal reversions that Groudon and Kyogre can undergo, all speak to the idea that Hoenn sits at a kind of hinge point in the world's history. Events there echo backward into deep time and forward into every subsequent era. The Sinnoh region's ancient history is the most extensively documented in any single game. The myth of Arceus and the creation of time and space has already been described, but beneath that cosmic layer, there are more specific records of human activity in the ancient Sinnoh that illuminate how early people understood the world they were living in. The temples around Lake Acuity, Lake Verity, and Lake Valor were built by people who understood that those three locations were meaningful in ways that went beyond their natural beauty or their utility as water sources. The carvings inside those temples reflect a spiritual tradition of considerable sophistication, one in which the relationship between human beings and the unseen forces of the world was taken with deep and careful seriousness. Team Galactic's eventual obsession with rewriting the universe using the power of Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina was not something they invented from nothing. Their leader, Cyrus, drew on actual ancient Sinnoh mythology to construct his vision of a world without spirit, a world remade from its most fundamental components. The fact that this plan could be conceived at all, that the architecture of the Pokemon universe genuinely does have an original point that a determined and misguided person might attempt to access, is part of what makes Sinnoh's lore feel so weightily significant. Cyrus was not chasing a fantasy. He was following a thread of genuine cosmic history toward a conclusion that would have unmade what Arceus had assembled. The Unova region offers a sharply different kind of ancient history, one that speaks less about cosmic creation and more about the earliest human societies and the foundations of the relationship between people and Pokemon as a cultural and ethical matter. Unova is geographically distant from the other regions, and its mythology reflects that distance with a distinct flavor and set of concerns. The central legend of Unova involves two heroes who lived in a very ancient time before the founding of any of the region's current cities, and who wielded the power of two dragons that represented opposing but not irreconcilable truths. One dragon embodied ideals, the other embodied their conflict was not a simple matter of good against evil, but a genuine tension between two valid ways of understanding the world. The two heroes who carried these dragons were brothers, and their disagreement was not born of malice, but of a philosophical difference that deepened over time until it became a genuine rupture. The Dragon of Ideals became Zekrom, a creature of pure black whose energy crackles with electricity and whose presence invokes a sense of absolute conviction. The Dragon of Truth became Reshiram, a creature of brilliant white whose flames burn with a kind of searching clarity and whose presence invokes the feeling of something being disclosed that had previously been hidden. When the brothers' argument became irreconcilable, their dragons fell dormant, retreating into stone forms known as the Darkstone and the Lightstone, waiting for new heroes who could carry their respective philosophies into a new age. Between Reshiram and Zekrom stands Kyram, the Hollow Dragon, a being whose empty interior speaks to the original wholeness that the two primary dragons once shared before the brothers separated them through their conflict. Kyram is not simply a third dragon in a series. It is the remainder, the part of the original dragon that was neither truth nor ideals, but the raw potential that both of those qualities depend upon. The ruins of the giant chasm where Kyram sleeps are ancient in a way that feels different from other legendary locations. The cold there is not merely physical. It carries a quality that players who spend time in that area often describe as melancholy, a sense of something waiting for a completion that has not yet arrived. The founding story of Unova also contains within it one of the most explicit engagements with the question of what the right relationship between people and Pokemon actually is. The two brothers disagreed about this, and their disagreement echoes forward across all of Unova's history, eventually producing a villain in N who genuinely believed that Pokemon should be liberated from all human relationships entirely, and a system in Team Plasma that exploited that genuine philosophical question for purposes of control. The depth of Unova's engagement with this question is part of what makes its generation feel so distinctively concerned with ethics rather than simply with adventure. The Kalos region reaches back into a history that is simultaneously ancient and deeply personal. 6,000 years before the events of the Kalos Games, a war of terrible scope was fought that consumed so much of the region that the king of Kalos at that time made a decision with consequences that the games describe as genuinely cataclysmic. Seeking to restore the life of a young woman named AZ, who had been lost in that war, the king built a machine of immense power and used it to drain the life force from Pokemon across the region, channeling that energy into the resurrection of the one person he could not bear to lose. The machine worked, but the cost was incomprehensible. The Pokemon whose life energy was consumed to power that machine became what the Kalos myth describes as the ultimate weapon, and when it was eventually used again in the war, its activation created something that did not simply defeat enemies, but transformed certain Pokemon near its focal point into a new kind of being. Creatures of extraordinary power whose connection to the weapon's energy persisted across 6,000 years. Those creatures became Xerneas and Yveltal. Xerneas, the life Pokemon, carries within its antlers the capacity to share life energy with other living things, a kind of continuous gift that flows outward from it. Yveltal, the destruction Pokemon, absorbs the life energy of everything around it as it prepares to sleep, carrying that energy within its body during the long hibernation that eventually ends in its rebirth as a cocoon and then as the great winged form once more. Zygarde, the third member of this triad, is the balance between them, a creature that exists in multiple incomplete forms and that assembles itself fully only when the balance of the ecosystem is genuinely threatened. Zygarde cells are scattered throughout the Kalos region at all times, monitoring, sensing, and waiting. The Kalos ancient history also contains the figure of AZ himself, who survived his own weapon's activation by drinking from the device before it fired, giving himself a kind of immortality he never asked for and never wanted. He wandered Kalos for 6,000 years, carrying with him a grief that did not diminish and a regret that no amount of time seemed sufficient to process. His eventual reunion with the small Pokemon he had once loved and thought permanently lost is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire sweep of Pokemon lore. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is so simple. An old man and a small creature finding each other again after an incomprehensibly long separation. The Alola region carries a history that involves the stars themselves. Alola sits in the middle of a warm ocean, and its people have always looked upward. The ancient records of the Aether Foundation's predecessors and the oral traditions maintained by the island kahunas speak of a time when creatures from somewhere beyond the known boundaries of the world arrived in Alola, passing through what the myths describe as wormholes and the fabric of the sky. These were the Ultra Beasts, entities from ultraspace who do not follow the physical and biological rules of the primary world. Their arrival was not always peaceful and not always intentional, but the relationship that developed between Alola and the creatures who arrived through those wormholes is at the core of the region's mythological identity. The Tapu Guardians of Alola's four islands are ancient presences of a different kind, territorial deities who have protected specific islands since before human habitation began. Tapu Koko, Tapu Lele, Tapu Bulu, and Tapu Fini each maintain a relationship with their island that is simultaneously protective and demanding. They require respect and will withdraw their favor when that respect is absent. The ruins where they reside on each island carry the traces of a civilization that understood this relationship clearly, one that built its entire social and spiritual architecture around the idea that the land and its protectors were partners, not resources. Cosmog, the small and fragile cosmic creature that can be found in Alola, contains within its tiny body a concentration of the same material from which stars are formed. The evolution of Cosmog, through Cosmoem and eventually into either Solgaleo or Lunala, describes a life cycle that mirrors stellar formation in a way that is both scientifically playful and mythologically resonant. Solgaleo carries the sun's energy and can open passages to other worlds through the force of its third eye. Lunala draws power from the moon and flies through ultraspace as naturally as an ordinary Pokémon might wade through a shallow stream. These two are not simply powerful Pokémon. They are the means by which the boundaries of the known world become permeable, the keys that open doors into everywhere else. The Galar region's ancient history reaches back to a time before written records in a different way, through what the game describes as the Darkest Day, an event of catastrophic scale that occurred in the deep past of that northern, industrially flavored region. An enormous Dynamax phenomenon of unknown origin threatened to consume everything. The two legendary wolves, Zacian and Zamazenta, fought to contain that threat using weapons and armors whose origins are not fully explained, but whose existence speaks to a relationship between those two creatures and the ancient human heroes who might have carried those objects. The Sword and Shield myths of Galar describe these two wolves as heroes in their own right, not merely powerful beings, but genuinely active defenders whose sacrifice in that ancient battle cost them something significant: long stretches of sleep, the loss of certain capacities, a weariness that has not fully left them. The Eternatus beneath Galar's crust is a being of extraterrestrial origin, a creature that arrived from space and whose energy is the source of the Dynamax phenomenon that the modern Galar region uses as a power source and a form of competition. The fact that the entire spectacle of Galar's cultural identity, the stadiums and the gigantic battles, and the Dynamax energy that runs through the earth like electricity, is ultimately traceable to an ancient cosmic entity sleeping under the ground, is the kind of detail that the Pokémon games hide in plain sight. The celebration and the commerce and the spectacle all rest on a foundation of ancient and potentially dangerous power that most of the people participating in it know nothing about. The Hisui region, known in the modern era as Sinnoh, occupies a specific historical moment that the games were eventually able to revisit directly. Legends Arceus placed players in the period before Pokémon training became the organized and formalized practice that all subsequent games take for granted. The people of Hisui in that era regarded Pokémon with a combination of reverence and fear that felt much more appropriate to the actual scale of difference between a human being and a creature that can command lightning or reshape terrain. The Survey Corps of the Galaxy Expedition Team was a genuine exploration enterprise, cataloging Pokémon and slowly building the foundation of knowledge that would eventually become the Pokédex tradition. The Hisui forms of various Pokémon speak to the reality that the same species, subjected to different environmental and evolutionary pressures, develops in meaningfully different directions. The Hisuian Growlithe with its rock element adapted to volcanic terrain. The Hisuian Braviary, with its psychic qualities, developed a more mystical relationship with the vast skies of that era. These variations are not merely cosmetic additions to the game, but pieces of evidence in the argument that the Pokemon world's biodiversity is a product of genuine processes that change over time, shaped by environment and circumstance, just as it is in the actual world. The noble Pokemon of Hisui, large and frenzied versions of particular species that were revered and cared for by specific clans, describe a system of human and Pokemon relationship that predates the trainer model entirely. These were not creatures being commanded or caught, but creatures being tended, maintained in a specific emotional and spiritual state through the offering of particular materials that could soothe their periodic frenzies. The clans that maintained these nobles understood that they were the caretakers of something larger than themselves, that the noble Pokemon were part of the land in a way that went beyond their individual existence. The transition from the ancient world to the recognizable present of the main series games is not something any single game describes explicitly. It happened over generations, across multiple regions, through the gradual development of the traditions and technologies that the player eventually encounters as established fact. Pokeballs, which now seem as natural and unremarkable as any other ordinary object, were in the Hisui era primitive wooden devices that apricorns were carved into by the craftsmen of the Survey Corps. Those early balls were unreliable and imprecise, and catching a large or particularly powerful Pokemon required significantly more preparation and patience than modern trainers are accustomed to. The development of the Pokédex as a research tradition began in Hisui with a task set by Professor Laventon and completed by the player character of Legends Arceus, but that was not the final or complete form of the device. Each generation brought more sophisticated versions, and the intellectual tradition that the Pokédex represents, the organized, systematic study of Pokemon as a field of knowledge, spread gradually from region to region as communication between those regions became more consistent. Professor Oak in Kanto, conducting his famous research in a town called Pallet, was in some sense the heir to an intellectual tradition that stretched back through the Survey Corps and beyond them to the very first people who looked at the creatures around them and decided to write down what they saw. The culture of Pokemon training as a rite of passage for young people appears in its most explicit form in Kanto, where the tradition of receiving a starter Pokemon and traveling through the region's 8 gyms before challenging the Elite Four is described as something everyone in the region participates in. But the gym system is not ancient. It is a formalization of older practices, a way of organizing and celebrating a relationship between people and Pokemon that existed long before anyone built a building with a puzzle inside it and called it a gym. The 8 gym leaders of any given region are the custodians of a tradition that goes back further than the buildings they inhabit, representing types of Pokemon and approaches to battle that have been refined across many generations of continuous practice. The Pokemon League itself, the summit of the competitive structure in each region, reflects the values of that region in ways that become more apparent when you trace the history of how different regions organized their own versions of it. Kanto's league is straightforward, almost classically structured, with a journey across open terrain and a summit that feels genuinely earned. Johto's league is more tradition-conscious, embedded in a region that remembers more of its own history and feels the weight of that memory more continuously. Hoenn's league is surrounded by the sea, accessible only through routes that demonstrate the trainer's comfort with the world's most dominant environmental element. Sinnoh's league sits at the end of a route through eternal snowfall, approaching a building that feels like it stands at the edge of something, rather than in the middle of things. The mythology embedded in each region's landscape is one of the most consistent and carefully tended aspects of the entire franchise's world building. No region is simply a series of routes connecting towns. Each one has a geographic logic that reflects the ancient history embedded in its soil. Kanto's cerulean cave, where the most powerful specimens seem inexplicably drawn to gather, sits above a city named for a particular shade of clear blue. Lavender Town, with its tower of commemorated Pokémon, rests in the east of the region where the light arrives first in the morning, a detail that feels like it might have been chosen deliberately to give that somber place a kind of continuous, gentle illumination. Empel, moon divides the eastern and western portions of the region in a way that makes every trainer feel, at least briefly, like they are crossing something genuinely significant when they pass through it. The events of the original Kanto games, when examined in the context of the full timeline, take on a different quality than they might seem to have in isolation. A trainer sets out from Pallet Town and over the course of their journey dismantles a criminal organization, defeats the current champion, and begins to reshape the competitive landscape of the region. These events are not cosmically significant in the way that the events of Sinnoh or Hoenn are. No one was trying to collapse time and space, but they happen against a backdrop of a world that contains all of those possibilities, and the ordinariness of the journey is part of what makes it so quietly moving. The world contains Giratina and Arceus and the machinery of creation. And within that world, a child from a small town with 3 starter Pokemon to choose from still matters. The Johto games sit immediately after Kanto in the timeline, with Gold and Silver and their remakes taking place roughly 3 years after the Kanto events. The connection between the two regions is physical as well as temporal. They share the same landmass, and a player who has finished the Johto journey can cross into Kanto and find it changed but recognizable, with the gym leaders aging slightly and the world moving forward in small visible ways. This continuity of geography and history is one of the most remarkable things about the early games. The world does not reset, it continues. The central conflict of Johto involves Team Rocket's attempt to re-establish itself after its defeat in Kanto, broadcasting a message on a radio frequency in the hope that their former leader will hear it and return. Giovanni does not return. The leader is never seen, and Team Rocket's gradual collapse through the course of the Johto games is a story about the way organizations built around fear and exploitation cannot sustain themselves when the fear is removed and the exploitation is exposed. There is something genuinely melancholy about Team Rocket and Johto, a criminal organization in the process of falling apart, its members still going through motions that no longer have the support structure they once had. The legendary trio of Raikou, Entei, and Suicune moves through Johto's tall grasses and weather events as living reminders of the event that created them. Suicune in particular, in the Crystal version of the game, becomes a central figure in a story about what it means for a wild Pokemon to choose its own trainer. Suicune does not wait passively to be caught. It observes, assessing multiple trainers before it decides which one is worthy of the encounter. This inversion of the usual catching dynamic, the Pokemon as the one doing the evaluating, is a small but meaningful detail that says something important about the kind of intelligence and discernment that the most powerful wild Pokemon might possess. Ho-Oh's presence in Johto creates a layered structure in the game's emotional register. The creature that restored life to the 3 legendary beasts now rests atop the Tin Tower, and reaching it requires gathering the Rainbow Wing, an object whose significance is tied to the moral character of the trainer attempting to use it. The Kimono Girls, who serve as gatekeepers to the legendary encounters, are among the most interesting recurring figures in the Johto narrative, precisely because they are not powerful trainers in the conventional sense. They are custodians of a tradition, people who have maintained a relationship with something ancient and important through continuous discipline practice, rather than through the accumulation of battle victories. The Slowpoke Well in Johto's Azalea Town is the location of one of the franchise's most quietly disturbing early confrontations with what the exploitation of Pokemon actually looks like in practice. Team Rocket's members in that location are not fighting or stealing or threatening in the most dramatic sense. They are systematically cutting the tails from Slowpoke and selling them as a luxury food item. The damage they are causing is quiet and repetitive rather than spectacular, and the recovery process for the community of Slowpoke and the people who care for them is not instant. This kind of grounded practical harm is unusual in the Pokemon games, and it gives the early Johto narrative a quality of moral seriousness that the more theatrical conflicts of later games sometimes lack. The Whirl Islands, surrounded by the churning currents that give them their name, hold Lugia in their darkest depths, a being of such delicate and powerful responsibility that it withdrew from the surface world specifically to protect that world from the consequences of its own existence. Finding Lugia requires navigating through layers of geography and difficulty that function as a kind of extended metaphor for the effort required to reach anything genuinely valuable. The currents push back. The cave systems are complex. And at the center of it all, in perfect stillness, is a creature that chose its solitude not from shyness, but from a kind of profound ethical seriousness about the weight of what it carries. The Hoenn games introduced the concept of Pokemon contests alongside the battle system, an acknowledgement that the relationship between people and Pokemon has dimensions that combat does not capture. The appeal of a Pokemon when it performs, when it executes a move with style and grace before an audience, is a different kind of bond than the one forged in battle. This addition to the world was not incidental. It reflected a genuine expansion of the philosophical space the games were willing to occupy, the idea that a Pokemon's worth is not reducible to its fighting capacity. The Hoenn region's physical landscape is genuinely distinctive in ways that feel ecologically specific. The warm currents of the surrounding ocean keep the air humid and the vegetation dense, and the towns that dot the region often feel embedded in their natural surroundings rather than imposed upon them. Four Tree City, built among the treetops of a forest whose inhabitants share the canopy with its human residents, is one of the clearest expressions of a design philosophy in which the integration of human and Pokemon spaces is not something to be achieved, but something that already exists and simply needs to be recognized. The Devon Corporation in Rustboro City represents the first sustained engagement in the main series games with the question of what happens when technological development outpaces the ethical frameworks needed to manage it. Devon's research into the internal structure of Pokemon evolution, their development of devices to interface with Pokemon consciousness, and their commercial interests in the practical applications of Pokemon biology are all present in Hoenn's narrative without being the central conflict. The central conflict is about the ancient forces of land and sea being used as weapons by two groups who disagree about which primal element should dominate. But Devon sits in the background of that conflict as a reminder that the most consequential threats to the world's balance are not always the most dramatic ones. The relationships between the five weather legendaries of Hoenn describe a system of checks that extends beyond the simple binary of land versus sea. Groudon and Kyogre are the most dramatic poles, but Rayquaza holds them in balance from above. Castform, a small Pokemon created by the Weather Institute and whose form changes with atmospheric conditions, is in some sense the most intimate expression of what weather actually means on a daily scale rather than a geological one. And the mythical Jirachi, which sleeps for 1,000 years and wakes for only 7 days at a time in the presence of a comet, represents the way that cosmic events and ordinary wishes occasionally intersect in the Pokemon world in ways that are simultaneously enormous and profoundly personal. The Battle Frontier, introduced in Hoenn's extended editions, represents the upper reaches of what the training tradition can produce. The facilities there test trainers not simply on the power of their teams, but on the depth of their strategic thinking, their ability to adapt to unusual formats, and their patience under conditions specifically designed to expose limitations. The facility operators, who wait at the highest achievement levels of each building, are among the most interesting characters in the Pokemon world precisely because they represent a different relationship with battle than the gym leader tradition does. They are not custodians of a type or a region, they are practitioners of a discipline, people who have devoted themselves to exploring the edges of what the battle system can express. The secret bases that trainers can create throughout Hoenn's wild areas speak to something that is easy to overlook in the sweep of the larger narrative. The world of Pokemon is not only a stage for the events that matter historically or cosmically, it is also a space in which individual people make small homes for themselves, arrange their spaces according to their own preferences, and invite others to visit. The secret base is a piece of persistent personal geography, a place in the world that bears the mark of an individual presence and that continues to exist whether or not anyone is currently paying attention to it. The Pokemon Emerald version's addition of a third path alongside Team Magma and Team Aqua, in which the player and Steven Stone together confront the possibility of a world that neither team intended, is one of the clearest expressions of the Hone game's underlying theme that the most dangerous mistakes are often the ones made by people who are absolutely certain they are right. Both Maxie and Archie believed genuinely in the value of what they were attempting. Their certainty made them incapable of recognizing the harm they were causing until the consequences were already in motion. The correction of that harm required a different kind of certainty, the willingness to face what had been unleashed without flinching, and to call upon the only presence in the world ancient and powerful enough to address it. The Sinnoh games introduced the underground as a significant space, vast networks of caves beneath the region's surface that contained fossils, rare items, and the material evidence of an extraordinary deep history. The fossils available in Sinnoh speak to a time when the evolutionary pressures of the world produced creatures adapted to conditions that no longer exist, creatures whose forms are strange enough to suggest environments radically different from any modern terrain. Cranidos, the skull fossil Pokemon, carries within its dense headplate the imprint of a world in which physical impact was the dominant currency of survival. Shieldon, the armor fossil Pokemon, developed its extraordinary defensive capacity in response to the same world. Their existence in the present day is possible only through the application of techniques developed by researchers who learned to read genetic information from stone, a quiet miracle that the games present as routine. The Poketch introduced in Sinnoh as a wrist-worn device represents the first clear gesture toward the way that technology has been gradually becoming more intimate in the Pokemon world, worn rather than carried, present on the body rather than kept in a bag. The relationship between trainer and device would become increasingly central in later generations, but its roots are here, in a small plastic device strapped to a young trainer's wrist in a northern region of considerable geological drama. The mythology of Sinnoh's lake area, with its three guardian spirits distributed across the water of acuity, verity, and valor, creates a landscape in which the most significant presences are not visible from the surface. The lakes seem, to a casual observer, simply to be beautiful water features in an otherwise mountainous and forested region. But the mythology the game has carefully established means that every time a player crosses a bridge over one of those lakes or stands at its shore, they are standing above something that exists at the intersection of the physical world and the cosmic forces that underpin it. The mundane and the mythological share space in Sinnoh more visibly than in almost any other region. Dialga and Palkia, when they are eventually confronted at the summit of Spear Pillar, represent the actual stakes of what Cyrus was attempting. These are not simply powerful Pokemon in the way that a particularly strong wild creature might be powerful. They are the conditions of existence itself given form. A trainer facing them is facing something that is in some sense more fundamental than any battle they have previously encountered or could previously have imagined encountering. The fact that the game treats this confrontation with the same mechanical framework as every other battle is not a failure of imagination, but a statement of principle. The ordinary tools of care and strategy and connection are sufficient for any challenge, no matter how cosmically significant that challenge turns out to be. Giratina's distortion world, accessed through a portal in the Turnback Cave that most players would miss if they did not know to look for it, is one of the most distinctive environments in the franchise. The rules of the space work differently. Platforms float in orientations that do not correspond to any gravitational logic. The colors are inverted and strange. Giratina moves through it with the ease of a creature entirely at home in a place that destabilizes every human intuition about how space should behave. The encounter with Giratina in that space, on its own terms, in the mirror world that was specifically shaped to contain it, has a quality unlike almost any other encounter in the games. It is not a battle for dominance. It is a meeting in the territory of something that is genuinely other, a recognition that the Pokemon world contains existences that operate by fundamentally different principles than the surface world most trainers inhabit. The Unova region's distant geography, separated from the other regions by a significant stretch of ocean, contributed to the development of a Pokemon population that evolved in almost complete isolation for an enormous period. The species of Pokemon native to Unova are almost entirely distinct from those found elsewhere, with very few genetic crossovers. This isolation is not simply a game design choice. It is a piece of world building that carries genuine implications for how one thinks about the Pokemon world's biodiversity as a product of geography and time. The seasonal system introduced in Unova, in which the world's landscape and the availability of certain Pokemon changed with the actual calendar month, was the first time the games acknowledged that the world their story takes place in is subject to the same rhythmic cycles that govern any real environment. Sawsbuck and Deerling change their appearance with the seasons. Certain routes look and feel different depending on when the player travels them. This was a small addition in mechanical terms, but its philosophical implications were significant. The Pokemon world does not exist outside of time. It ages. Its seasons turn. Its living things respond to those changes in exactly the ways that living things in any world do. The relationship between Reshiram, Zekrom, and the concept of truth versus ideals runs through the Unova narrative in a way that does not resolve into a simple conclusion. The player in N, who holds the opposing legendary dragon, are not simply hero and villain. They are the latest iteration of the argument the brothers first articulated in the Deep Path, a question that the games do not answer because it is genuinely unanswerable. Is it better to pursue truth, the world as it is, or ideals, the world as it should be? The answer the Unova games reach is that the argument itself is more valuable than any resolution, that the presence of both perspectives makes the world more complete than either one could alone. Team Plasma's internal division, which becomes explicit in the sequel game set 2 years later, speaks to the way that organizations built around genuine ideas eventually fracture when those ideas are tested by practical reality. The members who were truly committed to Pokemon liberation split from the members who were only ever committed to N's father Getsis and his private agenda of domination. The genuine believers and the cynical manipulators cannot sustain their alliance once the founding fiction that unified them is removed. This dynamic, visible in the background of Unova's story, is one of the most sophisticated pieces of character writing in the franchise's history. The Black City and White Forest, present in different versions of the same game but occupying the same geographic space, describe a world in which human and natural elements exist in a kind of dynamic tension. Black City fills with buildings and commerce when players interact with other trainers. White Forest fills with Pokemon and greenery. Neither state is presented as superior to the other. Both are real. Both are valid responses to the same underlying geography. This is, in miniature, the same question that Hoenn's Team Aqua and Team Magma fought over, but presented here as a matter of player choice and cultural exchange rather than violent conflict. The Kalos games introduced the concept of mega evolution, a transformation available to certain Pokemon when holding a specific stone and bonded with a trainer who also holds a corresponding stone, creating a shared resonance that temporarily pushes the Pokemon beyond its ordinary evolutionary maximum. The discovery of Mega Evolution was not a scientific development in any straightforward sense. It was more like the gradual recognition of something that had been possible all along, waiting for the right combination of conditions and understanding to manifest. The stones required for Mega Evolution, the Mega Stones and their trainer counterpart, Keystone, are found throughout Kalos, embedded in specific geological formations, carried by specific individuals, or hidden in specific places that require extensive exploration to locate. Their distribution across the region is not random. It reflects a deep historical connection to the weapon that AZ built 6,000 years early, which also operated through a resonance between stones and living things. Mega evolution is, in a very specific sense, a consequence of the ancient king's grief, a transformation of the world that happened because someone loved something enough to attempt the impossible. The Pokemon Village in Kalos, a hidden place where Pokemon, who have been abandoned by their trainers, gather and live together without human contact, is one of the most emotionally direct locations in the franchise. The Pokemon there are not wild in the conventional sense. They are not simply creatures that have never been caught. They are creatures who know what it is to be chosen and then set aside, who carry the memory of a relationship that ended, and who have built in their absence something that functions as a community of shared experience. Encountering Mewtwo there, in its largest and most powerful form, is a reminder that the same creature can hold very different things in its history. Mewtwo was created by science, escaped through violence, and eventually came to rest in a place populated by other Pokemon who have complicated relationships with human beings. Mewtwo's origin story, stretching back through the events of the original Kanto games and their associated mythology, is one of the franchise's earliest engagements with questions of identity and the ethics of creation. It was cloned from the genetic material of Mew, the primordial Pokemon whose Na contains the genetic blueprint for all other species. The scientists who created Mewtwo in the laboratories beneath Cinnabar Island and later in the Cerulean Cave were not asking whether it was right to create a new kind of consciousness. They were asking only whether it was possible. The consequences of that omission are still rippling through the world 3 generations later, in the shape of the being who wandered into the Pokemon village and rested there among others who also understand something about being made for purposes not their own. Zygarde's relationship with the Kalos ecosystem introduces a concept that became more fully developed in later games, but was introduced here quietly and without much fanfare. Zygarde exists in incomplete states, its cells distributed throughout the terrain, its 10% and 50% forms being only partial expressions of what it can become. When the ecosystem it monitors is under genuine threat, those cells gather, and Zygarde becomes complete form, a presence of enormous power, whose existence is an act of protective assembly rather than growth in any conventional evolutionary sense. The idea that a living thing might be distributed across an environment as a network of sensing points, only concentrating into a single form when the scale of a problem demands it, is one of the most ecologically interesting ideas the franchise has produced. The Alola games marked the first time in the main series that the gym structure was entirely set aside in favor of a different system, the Island Challenge, which organized the coming-of-age journey through a series of trials and totem Pokemon encounters rather than badge collections. This change was not arbitrary. Alola's culture, as depicted in these games, has a coherence and a history that makes the idea of 8 formal gyms feel like an import from a different kind of place. The Island Challenge is what a society that has developed its own traditions in relative isolation might actually produce, a form specifically shaped to the geography and the values of that particular corner of the world. The Alolan forms of Kanto Pokon, introduced in these games, describe the evolutionary consequences of a specific geographic situation. A group of species that arrived in Alola from distant regions, possibly through migration during an ancient period when sea levels or ocean currents were different, and adapted over many generations to the specific conditions of the island environment. Alolan Vulpix and Ninetales adapted to cold mountain habitats rather than warm fire environments, represent the most dramatic available reinterpretation of what those forms might become under different pressures. Alolan Exeggutor, grown enormously tall in the tropical sunlight, is sometimes described by the game itself as the original intended expression of what Exeggutor was always meant to be. A gentle joke that also carries a genuine observation about the relationship between environment and form. The Ultra Beasts introduced in Alola represent the franchise's most sustained engagement with genuinely alien life. These are not creatures from a different region or a different evolutionary lineage. They are beings from ultraspace, from dimensions with different physical properties, and their forms reflect those different properties in ways that make them deeply strange to encounter in the primary world. Nihilego, a jellyfish-like being of glass and toxins that can bond with human hosts, is among the most unsettling concepts the franchise has introduced. Its relationship with the antagonist Lusamine, who became obsessed with Ultra Beasts to the point of being consumed by one, describes an intimacy between human and Pokémon that crosses into something genuinely dark without the game losing its essential character, the Aether Foundation's stated purpose of rescuing and rehabilitating Pokémon. A mission that sounds straightforwardly benevolent reveals itself to be more complicated the more the player investigates. Lusamine's personal obsession corrupted the organization's work in ways that were invisible from the outside for a long time, and the Pokémon being held in the Foundation's care were not always there voluntarily or for reasons aligned with their well-being. The critique of institutional care that presents itself as altruism while actually serving the needs of the institution is subtle in the Alola games, but present, embedded in the architecture of a storyline that ultimately asks the player to distinguish between help that helps and help that merely satisfies the helper. Nebby, the Cosmog who becomes either Solgaleo or Lunala, depending on the version of the game, is introduced as a small, vulnerable creature whose significance is not apparent from its initial appearance. It looks fragile, it needs protection, and the impulse to protect it drives the player through most of the game's emotional arc. The revelation that this small thing contains within it the power to open passages between worlds and the capacity to evolve into one of the most cosmically significant Pokémon in the known universe is a reward for the patience and care the player has invested. Nebby's story is, at its simplest, a story about how the things that seem to need the most protection often carry within them exactly the capacity to transform what they eventually become. Necrozma, the light-devouring entity whose ancient history in Alola stretches back to a time before the current arrangement of the Ultra Wormhole system, represents a different kind of loss than the franchise usually addresses. Necrozma was once a being of pure light, the source from which Alola's Ultra Wormholes derived their illumination. It was shattered by an ancient civilization that tried to use its power as a resource. What remained was a being of desperate, consuming darkness that sought to absorb the light it had lost. The Ultra Sun and Moon game's extended engagement with this backstory gives Necrozma a quality of tragedy that is unusual for a legendary antagonist. It is not villainous in any ordinary sense. It is wounded in a way that became dangerous, and the restoration it eventually achieves is not simply a battle resolution, but something closer to a healing. The Galar region's industrial character, its love of spectacle, its stadiums, and its professional Pokémon battling culture creates a world that feels contemporarily familiar in ways that previous regions did not quite reach. The trains that connect Galar's cities, the broadcasting of Pokémon matches as major media events, the commercial sponsorships, and the public profiles of gym leaders as celebrities All of this is a version of the present that recognizes the world around it without losing the essential quality of being a Pokemon game. Galar engages with the aesthetics of modern life while still placing its story within a mythological framework of considerable depth. The wild area, introduced in Sword and Shield, represented the first time in a main series game that the overworld camera could be freely rotated and that wild Pokemon could be seen walking around their habitats rather than appearing only through random encounters. This was more than a technical advancement. It changed the phenomenological experience of moving through the Pokemon world. Seeing a Steelix emerge from a patch of rocky terrain, or watching a Gengar drift through a foggy section of the wild area before the player decides whether to engage with it, shifts the emotional register of encounter from abstract to visceral. The world feels inhabited in a way it did not quite feel before. Leon, the champion of Galar at the time of the game's events, represents one of the franchise's most interesting takes on the figure of the reigning champion. He is not distant or mysterious in the way that Lance or Cynthia might be perceived from a distance. He is warm, publicly beloved, navigationally terrible, and genuinely committed to the idea that Pokemon battles should be a source of joy for everyone involved. His relationship with his younger brother Hop, who is trying to follow a path defined by his siblings' extraordinary success, and his own relationship with the competitive pressure of having been undefeated for so long that the defeat he eventually faces is both surprising and clearly long overdue, give the Galar games an emotional texture that centers on the weight of expectation and the freedom of moving beyond it. Chairman Rowe's plan, which involves using Eternatus's energy to prevent a future resource crisis at the cost of triggering a catastrophic darkest day in the present, is among the most sophisticated motivations assigned to a Pokemon antagonist. He is not trying to destroy the world. He is trying to save it from a problem that he believes no one else has the courage to address directly. The tragedy is that his calculation was wrong and his method was catastrophic, but the underlying concern was legitimate. This moral complexity, a villain whose intentions were recognizably good even as his actions were genuinely harmful, continues the franchise's increasingly sophisticated engagement with the question of what makes someone's choices wrong, even when their purposes are sympathetic. The Crown Tundra and Isle of Armor, explored in the extended Galar content, each brought different dimensions of the franchise's deep history to the surface. The Isle of Armor's dojo tradition, presided over by Mustard, Leon's own mentor, reaches back through the gym culture to something older, a direct tradition of student and teacher that has maintained itself through generations and whose techniques contain accumulated wisdom that formal competition cannot always access. The Crown Tundra's exploration of the Regi temples, the arrival of Calyrex, and the legendary Pokemon dens that concentrated the most powerful creatures in the game's world all suggest that Galar sits above layers of history that its contemporary culture has largely stopped paying attention to, a familiar situation that the franchise engages with differently in each region it creates. Calyrex, the ancient king of the tundra, is a figure of considerable pathos. Once worshipped and powerful, now small and largely forgotten, it exists in the present day as a Pokemon of limited power whose memories of a grander era are not simply nostalgic, but practical, constituting the knowledge needed to reconnect it with its legendary horse companions, Glastrier and Spectrier. The process of restoring that connection through the cultivation of a specific carrot in a specific field using seeds that have not been used in a very long time is a piece of practical mythological work that describes, in small and quiet terms, what it means to care for something that time has diminished but not extinguished. The Paldea region, introduced in Scarlet and Violet, is perhaps the most spatially open of all the regions, a vast landscape whose exploration is structured not as a linear progression through a series of routes, but as a fully open environment that players can approach from any direction. This change in structure reflects a genuine expansion of the world-building philosophy behind these games, Paldea is not a corridor with choice points. It is a territory that rewards going places simply to see what is there. The terrestrial phenomenon, Paldea's signature mechanic, describes a transformation of Pokémon into crystalline forms that express an elemental type distinct from their ordinary nature. The aesthetic of terrestrialization, the way affected Pokémon appear to have been wrapped in faceted gemstone, connects Paldea's surface culture to the enormous crystals growing deep beneath it. The Area Zero at the center of the region is a geological anomaly of enormous scale, a crater in which the rock strata are exposed over hundreds of meters of vertical relief, each layer representing a different period of the world's history. The crystals growing in that area carry a concentrated form of the same energy that the terrestrial phenomenon expresses above ground, suggesting that the spectacle of the competitive and everyday terrestrial experience is a diluted and surface expression of something much more powerful in the earth below. The paradox Pokemon, found in the depths of Area Zero, present the franchise's most direct engagement with the concept of temporal anomaly. The ancient past forms, with their rough, unsophisticated appearances, suggesting organisms shaped by older and harsher selective pressures, and the future forms, with their metallic and mechanical qualities, suggesting descendants evolved in conditions where biological and technological elements have merged. Both exist in Area Zero simultaneously because of the time machine beneath it. The time machine was built or operated by an artificial intelligence construct, either the Professor Sada or Professor Turo, depending on the version of the game, who devoted their final years of operation to running the device because they believed that connecting the past and future would benefit the present. The sadness of that commitment, a machine operating in perpetuity in the service of a vision that had no mechanism of completion or rest, is handled with considerable care. Corydon and Miraidon, the mascot legendaries of Paldea, are versions of the same creature separated by an enormous span of time. They express what biology might look like when it is tested against two entirely different sets of evolutionary pressures, one set oriented toward raw natural power, and one toward efficient artificial biological integration. Riding them through Paldea's landscape, feeling the different qualities of their movement, is a way of experiencing the difference between past and future, not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a physical sensation, a way of understanding through one's body what time actually does to living things. The school setting of Scarlet and Violet, in which the player character attends the Naranja or Yuva Academy as a student, introduces a social context that previous games had not quite occupied with this level of commitment. The treasure hunt assignment that drives the player's exploration is given by a school, assessed by teachers, and discussed among classmates who are pursuing their own versions of the same broad directive. This framing does something subtle but important. It suggests that the training journey, which has always been a coming-of-age experience in the franchise's logic, benefits from being embedded in a context of shared inquiry and mutual support. The Academy's tradition of the treasure hunt is not simply a plot device. It is a pedagogical philosophy that values self-directed discovery as the primary means of genuine learning. Nimona, Arvin, and Penny, the three companions whose stories run alongside the player's own, each represent a different relationship with the central themes of the Paldea games. Nimona's unqualified enthusiasm for battle and her genuine joy in being challenged and occasionally surpassed is one of the most refreshing treatments of the rival character the franchise has produced. She is not competitive in the anxious or aggressive way that many rival characters have been. She is competitive in the way that genuine athletes are, for whom the best outcome is a match that pushes everyone involved to their limit. Arvin's story of an absent parent who turned out to have been present in a way they could not communicate is handled with unusual emotional directness for this franchise. And Penny's story of creating a network of support for Pokemon in difficult situations. And then needing that same support herself makes a quiet argument for the reciprocal nature of care that echoes the franchise's oldest and most central themes. The Kitakami region, Visited in the teal mask content reaches back into a historical event whose initial presentation as a local legend turns out to have been a distortion of actual events. A story in which the monster is not the monster and the heroes are not the heroes. The Loyal Three, treated as folk heroes in Kitakami's traditions, were in fact the aggressors in their ancient conflict with the Pokemon Ogerpon. The revision of that history, when it comes, does not destroy the cultural traditions built around the false version of events. It complicates them, adds a layer of accountability to the local community's relationship with its own past, and asks questions about how communities remember in ways that serve their emotional needs rather than the actual truth. Ogerpon, carrying within its mask the memory of a human friend long gone, is among the most emotionally detailed individual Pokemon in the franchise's history. The Indigo Disc content, returning to Blueberry Academy and exploring a different educational institution with different values than the Paldea schools, engages with questions about what it means to be genuinely elite in a way that is not entirely comfortable. The Bib League structure is more explicitly hierarchical, more focused on the acquisition of status through competition, and the characters navigating that structure are in various states of tension with it. Kieran's arc from enthusiastic friend to pressure narrowed rival to something more complex and searching when the pressure is finally addressed is one of the most carefully constructed character journeys in the extended Paldea story, and its resolution, quiet and incomplete in the way that human growth usually is, feels more honest than many franchise resolutions. The mythical Pokemon distributed across the generations describe, collectively, a set of existences that occupy the margins of the world's primary organizing systems. They are not part of any evolutionary family. They do not appear in the wild. They exist at specific intersections of the world's history and geography, expressing qualities or fulfilling functions that the more accessible layers of the Pokemon world do not address. Mew, as already noted, is the genetic source from which all other Pokemon species derive. It carries within its Na the blueprint for every form that Pokemon life has ever taken or could conceivably take. Its playfulness, its tendency to drift at the edges of perception, its apparent willingness to make itself visible only to those who approach it with genuine curiosity and open hands, are all qualities that speak to something fundamental about the franchise's relationship with discovery. The most foundational thing in the world is also the most elusive and the most joyful. Celebi exists in Ilex Forest in Johto, accessible through a shrine that the forest's people have maintained for generations, and it moves through time in both directions, without apparent effort. The things Celebi is said to do in the forest, the blossoming of unusual plants in places where it is rested, the maintenance of a kind of temporal echo in the oldest groves, describe a relationship with the forest that is not simply residence, but stewardship, an active involvement in the health of the living community of that place across all of its temporal states simultaneously. Jirachi sleeps in the dust of a comet for 1,000 years between its 7-day periods of wakefulness. When it wakes, it can grant wishes, a capacity that sounds like the premise of a folk tale, but that carries within it a more complex question about the relationship between desire and consequence. Wishes granted by Jiraki do not come free. The comet that brings Jiraki also carries a shadow, a force of destruction that the Millennium Comet's energy feeds. The franchise's engagement with this dynamic, most fully expressed in the fifth movie, suggests that wishes and their costs are inseparable, that the power to have something granted is never entirely separable from the question of what that granting costs and what it does to the one who asks. Deoxys arrived from space, its origin not in any evolutionary lineage, but in a mutation of a space virus that achieved extraordinary complexity in the radiation environment beyond the atmosphere. It is one of the few Pokemon whose biological nature is not derived from the world at all, a reminder that the Pokemon world exists within a universe that extends far beyond its own boundaries. Deoxys changes its form to express different functional priorities, shifting between states optimized for attack, defense, speed, or a balance of all three, a kind of biological plasticity that most evolutionary processes do not produce, but that the specific conditions of Deoxys's origin apparently did. Manaphy and Fione express the ocean's relationship with life in terms that are more intimate than the titanic forces of Kyogre and Lugia. Manaphy is born in the coldest deep waters and can create bonds of extraordinary depth with any living being it encounters, a capacity that the Sea Crown myth of the Pokemon Ranger games treats as the basis for a relationship of such intensity that it literally draws the ocean's creatures toward it. Phione, which can be bred from Manaphy but which cannot evolve back into it, is a gentle illustration of the way that certain qualities in living things are not easily replicated, even in their closest biological relatives. Shaman's dual nature, its ground form resting in flowering meadows, and its sky form taking flight when exposed to a specific graceful flower, speaks to the seasonal rhythms of the world in a way that connects it to the larger ecological systems the franchise occasionally makes explicit. Shaman cleanses pollution from the air and ground wherever it walks. And the gratitude flowers that bloom in its wake are the physical expression of an invisible service it performs continuously. The idea that there are small and quiet presences in the world doing work that sustains the environment without anyone necessarily noticing them is one of the franchise's most consistent and most gentle themes. Arceus's own relationship with the world it created is not one of continuous active management. After the creation, the myths suggest, Arceus became dormant, sleeping in the Hall of Origin at a height above Mount Coronet that most trainers will never reach without specific circumstances aligning. Its continued existence is the world's deepest foundation, but it is a passive foundation, a presence that holds everything in place simply by existing rather than by continuously doing. The question of whether Arceus can be disturbed from that rest, and what the consequences of disturbing it might be, is one that the games have approached with considerable caution, and that the events of Legends Arceus finally addressed directly. In an encounter that reframes the entire creation mythology in terms of personal relationship rather than cosmological distance. The flow of events across all generations creates a world that is simultaneously stable and continuously in motion. The ancient forces that shaped the continents and filled the oceans are still present in the earth and water. The legendary beings that moved through the world in its earliest ages are still moving, some of them, or still sleeping, in specific places where they have rested for geological periods. The civilizations that rose and fell left traces in the landscapes that current inhabitants navigate without always understanding what they are walking over. And the trainers and Pokemon and researchers and rivals who populate the present moment of each game are living their ordinary and extraordinary lives on top of all of that, aware of some of it and entirely unaware of the rest. The Pokédex, that continuous project of description and cataloging that began with the Survey Corps in Hisui and became formalized through Professor Oak and his successors, is the franchise's most explicit acknowledgement that knowledge of this world is always incomplete. No single Pokédex entry contains the full truth about any species. The entries contradict each other across generations. They are written from the perspectives of researchers with different priorities and different vocabularies and different relationships with the creatures they describe. This is not a flaw in the world building. It is a feature, an acknowledgement that the world is too large and too varied to be reduced to any single account of it. The version differences that define many Pokemon games, the availability of certain Pokemon in one version but not the other, the mascot legendaries who appear only in their respective game, the branching paths of the same basic story that lead to different encounters and different emphases are in some sense the franchise's acknowledgement that the world is larger than any single path through it can describe. No one trainer's journey is the complete story. No one version of events is the only version. The invitation to trade, to connect, To share Pokemon across the version boundary is the mechanical expression of a philosophical point. The world is completed by the combination of different perspectives, not by any single perspective carried to its limit. The relationship between Pokemon and the people who live with them is the franchise's central subject, and the range of that relationship across the timeline is extraordinary. From the fearful distance maintained by the earliest Hisui residents, to the organized competitive tradition of the gym system, to the contest halls and the Pokemon Ranger system and the Pokemon Amy, interactions and the camping and curries of Galar, and all the other ways. The franchise has found to express the idea that a relationship between a person and a Pokemon is richer and more varied than any single mode of. Interaction can capture. The full sweep of that history describes something genuinely moving about what it means to choose to share your life with other kinds of beings. The starters that each region offers as the beginning of every journey are the franchise's most direct and repeated statement of this relationship. 3 Pokemon, waiting in a professor's laboratory, or on a research table, or in a bag offered by a festival dancer, representing 3 different temperaments, 3 different elemental orientations, 3 different possible futures for the journey ahead. Choosing among them is the first and, in some ways, most consequential decision any trainer makes, not because it determines victory or failure in any absolute sense, but because it initiates a specific relationship that will shape everything that follows. The starter is not simply a tool, it is a companion, and the companionship begins in that first moment of choice. The player characters of each generation, though they are never the same individual from game to game, with only very rare exceptions, collectively represent a tradition of young trainers stepping out into the world and discovering it to be larger, stranger, more beautiful, and more demanding than anything they could have anticipated. They encounter criminal organizations and legendary Pokemon and ancient ruins and devastating natural forces and deep human sadness and unexpected joy. They meet rivals who challenge them and champions who inspire them and professors who guide them and gym leaders who test them. They catch hundreds of creatures and learn thousands of moves and carry within their small digital pockets entire ecosystems. And at the end of every journey, whether it ends at an Elite Four or a school assignment or a legendary confrontation at the edge of reality, they have become something that they were not at the beginning. A change that the franchise has always understood to be the real subject of every game it has ever made. The fossil record preserved in the various regions of the Pokemon world tells a story of biological history that runs parallel to the mythological one, and the two histories are not always easy to reconcile. The creatures frozen in stone and recovered by researchers are not simply curiosities, they are evidence of a world that existed before the current one, a world with different pressures and different possibilities, a world in which the trajectory of life was moving in directions that the present day's biodiversity does not straightforwardly contain. The dome fossil and helix fossil of Kanto, yielding Kabuto and Omanite respectively, speak to an ancient marine ecosystem of considerable complexity. Kabuto's resemblance to the trilobite, a real-world organism that dominated ocean floors in the deep past of actual Earth, is one of the franchise's most direct gestures toward paleontological reality. Omanite's spiral shell, the ammonite form that recurs across geological strata in the actual fossil record, carries within it a logic of biological efficiency that evolution finds again and again across completely separate lineages. The fact that these creatures can be restored from fossils by the empty moon researchers and others who have developed the relevant techniques suggests that the genetic information encoded in stone is not simply historical data, but something still active, still capable of expressing itself when given the right conditions. The old amber that yields Aerodactyl in Kanto describes a creature from an even deeper past, a flying predator of enormous speed and aggression whose form suggests a world in which the aerial environment was contested by animals that modern flying types would barely recognize as kin. Aerodactyl's rock typing, Unusual for a flying creature, reflects the conditions of its era, when the boundary between geological and biological was perhaps less distinct than it later became. The amber that preserved its genetic material is itself a material of remarkable history, tree resin, that hardened over millions of years into a substance stable enough to hold biological information through timescales that dwarf any human civilization. The cynofossils, the shield fossil and skull fossil, introduce a pair of creatures adapted to conditions of constant physical conflict, Shieldin with its extraordinary defensive development, and Cranidos with its enormously dense cranial plate, suggesting an animal whose primary competitive strategy involved impact forces that would be catastrophic by any modern standard. Their evolutionary lines, Bastiodon's fortress-like silhouette, and Rampardos' almost reckless headlong power, describe two ecological strategies from the same ancient period, one emphasizing survival through imperviousness, and one emphasizing victory through overwhelming force. The fact that neither strategy fully dominated, that both lineages existed simultaneously and whatever ecosystem produced them, suggests a world of competitive complexity rather than any single adaptive approach carrying the day. The Unova fossils, plume fossil and cover fossil, yielding Arkin and Tortuga, reach back to creatures that stand at evolutionary branch points of great significance. Arkin is described in its Pokédex entries as potentially the ancestor of all bird Pokémon, a creature that had not yet fully committed to flight, that hopped and half flew through an environment that had not yet shaped it into the fully aerial form its descendants would achieve. Tortuga's connection to the evolutionary history of sea turtle types in the Pokemon world similarly places it at a point where the direction of development was still being decided rather than established. These are creatures caught in the act of becoming, which makes them philosophically interesting in ways that the more fully formed ancient creatures are not. The Kalos fossils, jaw fossil and sail fossil, yielding Tyrant and Amora, describe the most dramatically different ancient environmental conditions of any fossil generation. Amora's bioluminescent frills and ice-type adaptation suggest an origin in extreme cold, in a period when the Kalos region, or its ancient precursor, had a climate radically different from its current temperate character. Tyrant's aggressive jaw, focused anatomy, speaks to a predatory ecology that the current Kalos landscape does not support, an indication that whatever world these creatures inhabited was organized around prey and predator dynamics of considerably greater intensity than what the modern region's peaceful routes and gentle weather might suggest. The Galar fossils present a situation that is, in the franchise's own terms, unusual and somewhat troubling. The researchers responsible for fossil restoration in Galar have been operating with incomplete fragments, combining elements from different ancient organisms in ways that produce viable but historically incoherent results. Dracovish, Arctozalt, Dracozalt, and Arctovish are each composite beings whose component parts do not naturally belong together, creatures whose biology is technically functional, but whose evolutionary history is entirely artificial, the product of a researcher's mistakes rather than the world's processes. The games treat this with a combination of humor and genuine discomfort that reflects something honest about the ethical dimensions of restoration science. Creating life is not the same as understanding it, and the fact that a thing can exist does not necessarily mean it should. The relationship between legendary Pokemon and the regions they inhabit is never simply a matter of impressive creatures residing in impressive places. Each legendary presence shapes the geography, history, and cultural consciousness of the region around it in ways that persist long after any direct interaction with those legendary beings has ended. The ancient influence of Suicune on the waterways of Johto can be felt in the region's orientation toward clean water as a cultural value, expressed in the lakes and rivers that feature prominently in its towns and in the preservation traditions maintained by its people. The weight of Dialga and Palkia and the knowledge of Spear Pillar at the peak of Mount Coronet gives Sinnoh a vertical dimension, an awareness of above and below, of depth and height, that other regions do not quite possess in the same way. The birds of legend, Articuno and Zapdos and Moltres in their Kanto forms, inhabit the extremes of the region's geography as if those extremes were specifically designed to be inhabited by them. Articuno rests in the ice caves of Seafoam Island, where the current pushes downward into chambers of eternal cold. Zapdos lives in the substations of the power plant, a facility that has been abandoned by human enterprise, but not by the electrical presence that found its specific conditions precisely hospitable. Moltres climbs to the peak of Victory Road, where the ascent toward the Pokemon League is also, it turns out, an ascent toward a different kind of encounter than the competitive one that drives most trainers up that final slope. Each of these placements is too specific to be accidental. They express something about how the legendary Pokemon and the world they inhabit have reached arrangements with each other over time. Mewtwo's location in the Cerulean Cave, accessible only to trainers who have already defeated the Elite Four and demonstrated a level of competence that the cave itself validates through the strength of the Pokemon who live in it, describes a system of preparation that functions not as gatekeeping, but as genuine readiness assessment. The cave does not prevent access to those who are not prepared. It simply ensures that reaching its deepest chamber requires exactly the qualities that an encounter with what waits there demands. The world has a way of arranging these things. What is worth reaching is rarely reached without adequate preparation, and the geography of the Pokemon world often expresses that principle in ways that feel less arbitrary than they might initially appear. The Tapu Guardians of Alola carry a specific relationship to the concept of territorial protection that distinguishes them from most other legendary types. They are not cosmic presences or primordial forces, they are local. Their power is real and considerable, but it is oriented outward from a specific place rather than toward any universal purpose. Tapu Koko's crackling electric energy is the energy of Melamele's coastlines. Tapu Lele's psychic force is the force of Akala's volcanic highlands. Tapu Bulu's grassy power is the power of Ula Ula's upland pastures and forests. Tapu Fini's aqueous mystery is the mystery of Pony's deep ocean approaches. Together they describe a system of regional protection that is granular and specific in a way that the broader cosmic legendaries are not, and that specificity makes them feel genuinely present in the land rather than simply residing there. The legendary horses of Galar, Glastrier, and Spectrier represent elemental forces in their most concentrated and least mediated forms. Glastrier is cold, heavy, unyielding, advancing across any terrain with a force that does not acknowledge obstacles. Spectrier is smoke and darkness, moving through the world as ghost energy does, present and absent simultaneously. Their association with Calyrex, the ancient king who must relearn to ride them, describes a relationship between authority and power that is one of the franchise's more politically interesting mythological arrangements. The king cannot govern simply by commanding. The king must demonstrate worthiness. The power does not belong to the title. The human institutions of the Pokemon world, the gyms and the league and the Pokemon centers and the Pokemarts and the ranger stations and the schools and the academies, collectively describe a civilization that has organized itself extensively around its relationship with Pokemon. These institutions are not incidental. They are the expression of what a society looks like when the most significant fact of its existence is the presence of other kinds of minds, other kinds of power, other kinds of beauty in the world alongside human beings. The Pokemon centers that appear in every town, providing free restoration of health to any Pokemon brought to them, describe a public health infrastructure whose generosity is so complete and so normalized that trainers rarely think about what it represents. A civilization that provides universal free care to the Pokemon of any traveler who enters its borders has made a collective decision about the value of those beings that is expressed in institutional architecture rather than in rhetoric. The Chansey and Blissey and Audino, who staff these centers and whose natural affinity for healing is channeled into the service of that institutional purpose, are not employees in any simple sense. They are participants in a system whose values align with their own deepest capacities. The gym system, from the first badge to the eighth, in every region that uses it, describes a pedagogical structure that uses combat as its primary instructional mode, while embedding within that combat a set of values and lessons about partnership, strategic thinking, and the proper relationship between strength and responsibility. The gym leaders who administer this system are not simply strong trainers. They are the custodians of a type specific body of knowledge, practitioners who have devoted themselves to understanding the full complexity of a particular kind of Pokemon, and who share that understanding through the specific challenges they design for those who come to them. Misty's teaching through water type encounters is about fluidity and adaptability. Brock's teaching through rock types is about endurance and foundation. Every gym leader in the logic of the franchise is a teacher whose classroom is a battle arena and whose lesson plan involves discovering what the student can do under genuine pressure. The Elite Four in each region represents something different from the gym progression. The gym leaders are distributed across the region, accessible at various points in the journey, each one a landmark in the developing trainer's progress. The Elite Four are concentrated at a single destination, encountered in sequence only after all other preparation has been completed. They are not teachers in the same sense. They are validators, figures who confirm that the journey has produced what it was supposed to produce. And the champion who waits beyond them is the fullest expression of what the training tradition makes possible. A person whose relationship with their Pokemon has reached a depth and quality that the framework of competition can recognize but not entirely explain. The Pokemon League has changed significantly across generations. Early championships were straightforward competitions with relatively little narrative context. Later ones have become increasingly embedded in the stories the games tell, with champions whose personal histories and relationships with the player character carry weight beyond the purely competitive. Lance's commitment to the conservation of rare dragon types speaks to a relationship with Pokemon that extends beyond competitive success. Cynthia's scholarly interest in Sinnoh mythology makes her simultaneously the region's strongest trainer and one of its most dedicated researchers. Stephen Stone's geological expertise and his collection of steel types connect his approach to battle with a broader understanding of the world's physical history. These champions are not simply obstacles at the end of a journey. They are expressions of what the world's training tradition, at its best, produces. The evolution mechanic, through which most Pokemon transform into more developed forms, is so central to the franchise that it is easy to forget how philosophically significant it is as a concept. Evolution in the Pokemon world is not the slow, population-level process of natural selection that the word describes in the context of actual biology. It is an individual transformation happening within a single creature's lifetime in response to experience and relationship, and sometimes in response to specific environmental conditions. A Pokemon does not simply grow stronger through battling. At some point, given sufficient experience, it becomes something else. Something that still contains the creature it was, but that has reorganized around a new set of capacities and a new form. The happiness-based evolution mechanic, through which certain Pokemon can only evolve when their bond with their trainer reaches a sufficient level of genuine mutual care, is one of the most significant design elements in the franchise. It encodes into the game's mechanics the principle that certain transformations cannot be forced or rushed. They emerge from relationship. Eevee's evolution into Espeon or Umbreon is not a matter of reaching a particular level of combat experience. It is a matter of the quality of the time spent together between the Pokemon and the person who cares for it. The game does not explain this relationship in philosophical terms. It simply requires it, makes it the condition of a specific and beautiful change. The stone evolutions, by contrast, describe a different kind of transformation, one triggered not by relationship or experience, but by contact with a specific external element. A firestone to Vulpix, becoming Ninetales, a waterstone to Poliwhirl, becoming Poliwrath. These evolutions suggest that certain potential forms are locked within a creature's biology from the beginning, waiting for the specific chemical or energetic trigger that will release them. The trainer's role in these evolutions is less about ongoing relationship and more about access, the ability to locate and apply the specific catalyst that the biological potential has always been waiting for. Trade evolutions present yet another mechanism, forms that emerge specifically through the active exchange between trainers. The philosophy embedded in this mechanic is subtle but real. There are transformations that only happen in the context of a relationship between multiple people. Haunter becoming Gengar, Graveler becoming Golem, Kadabra becoming Alakazam, these changes happen in the space between one trainer and another, in the act of passing something precious to someone else and receiving something precious in return. The social dimensions of the Pokemon world, the way that the training tradition is by design a community enterprise rather than a solitary one, are crystallized in the trait evolution in a way that is both mechanically functional and philosophically coherent. The move-based evolutions, in which a Pokemon transforms after learning or using a specific attack, suggest that certain developmental thresholds are not about experience in general, but about the acquisition of specific capacities. Mime Jr. becoming Mr. Mime after learning Mimic is about the mastery of a particular kind of social performance. Bonsley becoming Sudowoodo after learning Mimic follows a similar logic. These are creatures whose developmental milestone is not the accumulation of general competence, but the achievement of a specific definitive act, a moment when what they have been preparing to do becomes what they actually do, and something new emerges from that achievement. The regional evolution variants introduced in later games add another dimension to this already complex picture. Pokemon whose evolutions take different forms in different regions, like the Galarian Farfetch'd evolving into Sirfetch'd through a process that requires landing a specific number of critical hits in a single battle rather than the Cantonian method, describe a world in which even the biology of individual development is shaped by the environment and culture in which a creature grows up. A Farfetch'd and Galar, trained in a region with a strong tradition of combat honor and disciplined fighting craft, achieves its evolution through a different kind of proof than one raised elsewhere. The world shapes the creature. The creature responds to the world, and the transformation that results is specific to the intersection of that particular being with that particular set of conditions. The concept of shiny Pokemon, creatures with alternate color palettes that appear with extreme rarity in the world, operates in the franchise's logic as a visual marker of extraordinary chance. The mechanics that determine shininess in these games are probability based, the result of a genetic lottery that the world conducts for every Pokemon encountered. A shiny Pokemon is not different in any functional sense from a non-shiny member of the same species. Its power, its moves, its personality are not affected by the palette change. What is different is simply the visual impression of extraordinary chance, the encounter with something that the world produces so rarely that most trainers will go their entire journeys without seeing one in the wild. The cultural significance of shinies within the Pokemon fan community reflects something genuine about the appeal of rarity as a concept. The value attributed to a shiny Pokemon is not straightforwardly about power or utility. It is about the event of encounter, about the moment of recognition when a creature appears with an unexpected color and every prior experience with that species is reframed around the possibility of difference. A shiny Pokemon is proof that the world contains more variety than its apparent rules would suggest, that the parameters governing the possible are wider than the probable, and that spending time in that world is an activity that might, at any moment, produce something genuinely unrepeatable. The Pokris, a rare viral infection that doubles the efficiency of a Pokemon's training gains, is one of the strangest and most frequently misunderstood elements of the franchise's internal biology. It is extremely rare to encounter and cannot be distinguished from normal health by any visual indicator, detectable only by the Pokemon Center nurses who diagnose it in passing. Its effects are entirely beneficial. There is no downside, no trade off, no cost. A Pokemon that has had Pokerus and recovered retains the training benefit permanently, even though the active infection is long gone. The franchise presents this as simply a fact of the world, without much explanation, a thing that exists because biology is sometimes unexpectedly generous rather than always balanced toward neutral or costly outcomes. The concept of held items, objects that Pokemon can carry with them into battle to provide specific effects, introduces a dimension of material culture into the world's relationship between trainer and Pokemon. The choice of which item to give to which Pokemon is a form of care that is simultaneously practical and expressive. A choice scarf speaks to a belief in the Pokemon's speed as its most valuable asset and a willingness to limit its tactical flexibility in service of maximizing that asset. A leftovers placed on a defensive Pokemon speaks to a philosophy of endurance, of maintaining presence and health over time rather than seeking quick resolution. A focus sash, carried by a fragile but powerful attacker, is an act of faith, a commitment to the possibility that one hit point and the chance it provides is worth the risk of carrying almost no protection against a knockout. The berries that grow throughout the world and that can be given to Pokemon as held items describe an agricultural dimension of the human Pokemon relationship that is rarely discussed but always present. Someone plants those trees, someone tends them. The varieties of berries available in each region reflect the specific agricultural traditions of that region's people, and the uses to which those berries can be put: healing, reducing burns and paralysis and confusion, activating at critical health thresholds to restore fighting capacity, describe a folk medicine and agricultural science that has been developed over many generations of observation and careful cultivation. The world's relationship with its plants, like its relationship with its Pokemon, is the product of enormous, accumulated attention and care. The antagonist organizations across the franchise's timeline, examined together, describe a spectrum of ways in which the ordinary desire to reshape the world can become harmful when uncoupled from ethical constraint. Team Rocket, which appears across Kanto and Johto, is the most explicitly criminal of the major organizations, operating as a mob-style enterprise that exploits Pokemon for profit without any ideological justification beyond the accumulation of power and resources. Giovanni's vision for Team Rocket, as the games gradually reveal it, was never about a better world. It was about control, about using Pokemon as a means of expanding his organization's reach into every corner of society. The banality of that motivation, its ordinariness compared to the cosmic ambitions of later villains, makes it in some ways the most realistic portrait of how harm actually operates in the world. Team Aqua and Team Magma in Hone represent the franchise's first attempt at an antagonist organization driven by genuine, if catastrophically misguided, ecological concern. Archie believed that expanding the ocean would restore a primal balance beneficial to all life. Maxie believed that expanding the land would do the same. Both were wrong, not because their concern for the world's health was insincere, but because their models of what the world needed were both incomplete, and because neither of them was willing to entertain the possibility that the other might have a valid perspective. The conversation they could not have between themselves was the one that might have prevented everything. Team Galactic's nihilism, Cyrus's genuine conviction that the universe with its emotions and its imperfections and its suffering was not worth preserving, is the franchise's most philosophically ambitious antagonist concept. Cyrus does not want wealth or power in any conventional sense. He wants to reach the beginning of everything and make different choices, to construct a universe without the qualities that, in his experience, produced only pain. The tragedy of his plan is that the qualities he wanted to remove, emotion, willpower, the capacity for attachment, and therefore for loss, are exactly the qualities that make the universe worth having. The late guardians, who embody knowledge, emotion, and are not incidental to the story. They are its argument, the proof, walking and swimming, that what Cyrus wanted to eliminate was the very thing worth protecting. Team Plasma's complexity, already discussed in part, extends through both Black and White and their sequels into a portrait of how idealism is captured and exploited by those who recognize its emotional power without sharing its values. N's genuine love for Pokemon and his genuine distress at what he had seen of the training tradition at its worst were real. The way Getsus used those genuine feelings as a vehicle for his own ambitions, amplifying them selectively and directing them toward conclusions that served not Pokemon liberation, but Getsus's personal domination, is one of the franchise's clearest explorations of the relationship between genuine idealism and political manipulation. Team Flare in Kalos presents an antagonist structure rooted in aesthetic elitism, a group organized around the belief that beauty and exclusivity justify the destruction of everything they consider beneath their standard. Lysandre's activation of the ultimate weapon, motivated by a kind of despair about the world's capacity to achieve the ideal he envisioned for it, mirrors in the franchise's present the action that AZ took 6,000 years earlier in grief rather than ideology. The parallel is not accidental. It is the game's way of saying that certain decisions, once made, repeat themselves across time in slightly different forms until the conditions that generate them are understood and addressed. Team Skull in Alola, operating as something closer to a gang of young people who have been failed by the systems meant to support them than as a world-threatening organization, is the franchise's most sympathetic portrayal of an antagonist group since Team Rocket's individual grunts began to be humanized in later games. The members of Team Skull are not menacing in any cosmic sense. They are young, struggling, lacking direction, and making choices that reflect the absence of the guidance and opportunity they deserved. Potown, the dilapidated area Team Skull has claimed as their territory, is not a threatening base of operations. It is a very sad attempt at a home, made by people who have not been offered anywhere better to be. The various team organizations of Galar, Paldea, and the other recent regions each continue this evolution toward more nuanced antagonist portraits. The threat is rarely as simple as wanting to destroy the world, and even when world-threatening power is involved. The motivation behind its use is almost always rooted in something recognizably human, a fear of inadequacy, a grief that could not be processed, a genuine concern that metastasized into something dangerous. The franchise has become increasingly willing to hold its antagonists in this kind of moral complexity, and the result is a series of stories that take seriously the question of how good intentions become harmful actions. The environment of the Pokemon world, taken as a whole across all regions, describes a relationship between human settlement and natural space that has evolved over time from the fearful distance maintained in Hisui to the deeply integrated coexistence visible in places like the Alolan Islands or the ancient forests of Johto. The wild spaces between towns are not simply zones of danger or resource extraction, they are habitats maintained in their current condition by a complex web of relationships between the Pokemon who live in them and the systems, ecological and otherwise, that sustain those populations. The idea that certain Pokemon are never captured, that some individuals choose to remain wild regardless of how many trainers have pursued them, is embedded throughout the franchise but rarely made explicit. The roaming legendaries of each generation, those who move across the map rather than waiting in a fixed location, are the clearest expression of this quality. Entei moving through Johto's tall grass at enormous speed, Latios crossing the sky above Hoenn's ocean routes, the legendary birds of the wild area moving between different weather conditions, these Pokemon are not simply catchable entities waiting for the right trainer. They are expressions of the world's own freedom, of the wildness that exists independently of any human agenda and that continues whether or not anyone is paying attention to it. The national park in Johto and its bug-catching contest is one of the franchise's most explicitly conservationist set pieces, a protected area where the ecological community of insect Pokemon is maintained through the establishment of clear rules about how humans may interact with it. Contestants can enter, can catch, can participate in the ecosystem's logic, but must release what they do not keep, and must operate within spatial and temporal limits that prevent their participation from becoming extraction. The prize system of the contest rewards excellence in catching without rewarding exhaustion of the resource, an implicit model of sustainable relationship that the franchise embeds in a children's game without any explicit environmental lecture. The Safari Zone, appearing in various forms across multiple regions, presents a different model of human wildlife interaction, one in which the controlled environment serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It provides a space where rarer and more unusual Pokemon can be observed and occasionally caught. It provides revenue that supports the conservation of those animals. And it provides an encounter that is deliberately constrained, in which the tools available to the trainer are limited and the standard rules of capture do not entirely apply, so that the difficulty of the encounter reflects some quality of the animals themselves rather than simply the trainer's preparation level. The Safari Zone is not perfect, and later games would revisit and revise its logic in ways that acknowledge its limitations. But as a piece of world building, it describes a society that has thought, at least partially, about the ethics of access to wildlife. The berry growing systems available to trainers in various games, the Pokeblock and Poffin recipes that transform berries into performance enhancing treats, and the entire range of agricultural activities available in Pokemon games from Generation 3 onward all point to a civilization with a sophisticated relationship between cultivation and care. Growing a berry takes time, attention to watering schedules, understanding of the conditions that different varieties need. Preparing a Poffin or Pokeblock requires attention to the quality and combination of ingredients. These activities do not simply produce items with mechanical effects, they produce the experience of paying sustained attention to something that needs ongoing care. And that experience is itself a form of the practice that the franchise places at the center of every trainer's development. The music of the Pokemon world, as experienced by those who live within it rather than those who play the games from outside, must have a character that the game's soundtracks can only gesture toward. The world contains creatures that have evolved specifically to produce and respond to sound. Jigglypuff's song, which puts listeners to sleep. Chateau's ability to learn and reproduce human speech. Meloetta's ancient forms whose dances are tied to the mythological history of a specific power. Crickettoon's violin body playing. Noivern's echolocation that maps terrain through sound. The acoustic ecology of the Pokemon world is dense and complex in ways that its human inhabitants have probably learned to navigate without thinking about, the way anyone living near persistent natural sounds eventually stops noticing them. Chateau's mimicry of human language is one of the franchise's most direct acknowledgments that the boundary between human and Pokemon communication is permeable. Most Pokemon communicate through sounds that trainers cannot interpret directly, requiring the kind of close relationship and careful observation that develops over time into something resembling mutual understanding. Chateau short-circuits this process through direct acquisition of the sounds themselves, producing an experience that feels like comprehension even when it is something closer to very sophisticated echo. The philosophical implications of this, whether a creature that can perfectly reproduce speech is thereby making meaning in any sense the way its human models do, is a question the franchise does not pursue, but that the existence of Chateau makes it impossible entirely to avoid. The Pokemon, who are described as particularly intelligent in their Pokédex entries, Alakazam with its IQ of 5,000 and its brain said to contain more computing capacity than any human ever has achieved. Metagross, whose 4 combined brains give it a processing capacity that its entries describe as exceeding supercomputers. Slowking, whose transformation expands its intelligence and its access to ancient knowledge to an extraordinary degree, collectively describe a range of cognitive capacity in the Pokemon world that dwarfs anything available to human beings in that world. The fact that these creatures participate in the training system can be caught and raised and battled with, rather than transcending that system entirely, says something interesting about the relationship between raw intelligence and other qualities that the franchise values. Being smarter does not make one better. Being stronger does not make one superior. The most valuable qualities in the world of Pokemon, as the franchise has consistently shown, are not those that rank on any single dimension, but those that emerge from genuine relationship. The psychic type, which encompasses many of the franchise's most cognitively sophisticated Pokemon, also contains, within its range of abilities, some of the most ethically complex powers the games describe. Gardevoir's ability to create a small black hole, capable of collapsing light and matter, is presented as something it does in defense of its trainer, an act of absolute protection rather than aggression. Gengar's ability to lower the surrounding temperature and to travel through the shadows of other creatures speaks to a relationship with the boundary between life and death that is not menacing in the franchise's terms, but simply a feature of what Gengar is. The ghost type in general describes a category of being that exists in the liminal space between the living and something else. Creatures whose relationship to mortality and consciousness and the physical world is fundamentally different from that of any living creature, and who have, within the world's logic, their own kind of dignity and coherence. The distinction between ghost type and simply being a ghost, in the philosophical sense, is one that the Pokemon world navigates through the relationship between ghost type Pokemon and the actual deceased Pokemon that are honored in places like Pokemon Tower. The memorial in Lavender Town is for Pokemon who have died, and there is clearly a difference in the world's understanding between a Ghastly or a Gengar and the genuine passing of a creature that has been loved and lost. This distinction, rarely made explicit but continuously present in the way different locations handle death and ghostliness, suggests a world with a sophisticated understanding of what different kinds of absence mean and how different kinds of presence should be treated. The historical continuity between the events of different games, when traced carefully, produces a picture of the Pokemon world that is more interconnected and more temporally coherent than it might initially appear. The 3 years between Red and Blue and Gold and Silver are visible in the changed conditions of the same landscape. The events of Colosseum and XD in the Ouray region, taking place in a world without wild Pokemon where shadow Pokemon have been weaponized, describe an extreme version of what happens when the relationship between people and Pokemon is entirely subordinated to the logic of combat and control. The purification of those shadow Pokemon, which requires extended care and relationship rather than simply defeating them, is a direct statement about what it takes to heal something that has been traumatized through the destruction of its capacity for connection. The events of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, operating in a world where the player character is a human transformed into a Pokemon, describe the training tradition and the Pokemon world from an entirely different perspective, one in which the distinction between person and Pokemon is collapsed in favor of an experience of complete immersion. The implications of that perspective, the way it transforms how one understands the creatures encountered in the main series games, is one of the most philosophically interesting things the franchise has produced. What does a Pokemon's experience of the world look like from inside? The Mystery Dungeon games make an attempt to answer that question, and the answer they produce is surprisingly coherent with the main series' values while being genuinely different in texture and emphasis. The Rangers in the Pokemon Ranger games work with Pokemon through a system of temporary partnership rather than permanent capture, a model that acknowledges both the value of the trainer-Pokemon relationship and the possibility of a relationship that serves specific situational purposes without becoming a permanent claim. The capture styler used by rangers creates a temporary bond through a circular gesture that draws the Pokemon's energy into alignment with the ranger's purpose, allowing them to work together briefly and then releasing the Pokemon back to its natural context. This model of relationship, more situational and less possessive than the standard training tradition, describes one possible future for how the world's human Pokemon relationship might evolve, a future in which the permanent bond is recognized as one valuable possibility among several rather than as the only proper form of engagement. The Pokemon world's geography is not static. Across the full span of generations, the land itself has been shown to be something that changes in response to events that ordinary daily life rarely makes visible. The volcanic activity that shaped Cinnabar Island's eventual fate, a destruction described in the games as having occurred between the events of Red and Blue and the events of Firered and Leaf Green, demonstrates that the world's landforms are subject to forces that operate on timescales much longer than any individual trainer's journey. The island was there, and then it was not, replaced by a floating reef above a volcanic remnant that carries within it the memory of what used to stand there. The laboratory that produced Mewtwo, once a fixture of the island's identity, became rubble beneath the sea. This kind of geological time is the same time that produced the fossil layers in Sinnoh's underground and the ancient stone formations in Hoenn's sea routes. It is the same time that the legendary Pokemon experience from within their own long lives. The ocean roots of every coastal region describe a relationship between the world's human inhabitants and the sea that is simultaneously practical and deeply aware of the forces moving beneath the surface. The use of surf to cross water, the encounters with water-type Pokemon that populate those routes, the discovery of sunken ships and underwater ruins, and the remnants of ancient events visible from the water's surface, all of these constitute an ongoing engagement with the maritime dimension of the world that the inland routes cannot provide. The ocean in the Pokemon world is not simply a barrier between land masses. It is a territory as fully inhabited and as historically rich as any forest or mountain range, and the trainers who travel across it with Lapras or Wailmer are passing over an ecology and a history that extends downward in every direction. The sunken SS Anne in Vermilion Harbor, accessible via dive in the Pokemon games that introduced that mechanic, is among the most evocative historical sites in the franchise. A ship that was active and significant in the Kanto events has become, over time, a habitat. The Pokemon that now inhabit the spaces that were once human passenger cabins and cargo holds have made the structure their home without any particular awareness of what it was before they arrived. The ship is both ruin and ecosystem, both monument and dwelling, both end of one thing and beginning of another. This coexistence of what was and what is, of human history becoming natural space, is one of the franchise's most quietly powerful recurring images. The ocean ruins scattered throughout the Pokemon world, from the ruins of Whirl City near the Whirl Islands, to the ancient structures visible in Hoenn's water routes, to the deep sea shrines that certain legendary water types inhabit, collectively describe an age in which the sea level was different and in which the cultural activities of coastal civilizations extended to. Places that are now submerged beyond the reach of ordinary divers. The implication is that the world the current generation of trainers inhabits is not the same world that the ancient civilizations inhabited. The coastlines have moved, the habitable areas have shifted, and the records of what was built and understood and believed by the people who lived in those now sunken places are mostly lost, preserved only in the fragments that the deepest divers and the most patient researchers can still find and interpret. The concept of mega evolution, when examined in the context of the full timeline, suggests that the bond between a specific trainer and a specific Pokemon can reach a depth that temporarily exceeds the ordinary limits of what either of them can achieve independently. This is not a universal capacity. Not every Pokemon can mega evolve. Not every trainer can access the keystone that enables the transformation. The conditions that allow it involve specific geological history, specific biological potential, and specific relationship qualities simultaneously, a convergence that the franchise presents as genuinely rare precisely because each of those conditions is not automatically met. The megastones distributed throughout the world in specific locations connected to the ancient weapon and the ancient king are not simply items waiting to be found. They are the residue of a history, markers of the point where a grief driven act of extraordinary power touched the ground and changed it in ways that persist thousands of years later. Z moves in Alola describe a different model of the relationship between trainer and Pokemon at its maximum intensity, one in which a shared dance, a physical performance of synchronized movement and intention, channels an enormous release of type specific energy. The Z Ring and the Z Crystals, carried by specific Pokemon, are not simply power amplifiers. They are instruments of mutual attunement, requiring that both trainer and Pokemon reach the same state of focused readiness simultaneously. The physical expressiveness of the Z move activation, the way the trainer must perform a specific series of movements that vary by type and by crystal, embeds the bond between person and Pokemon in the body rather than simply in the abstract categories of friendship or loyalty. You cannot perform a Z move distracted or half hearted. The world will simply not respond to that. Dynamax and Gigantamax in Galar take this amplification to its spatial maximum, filling the natural arena of the Pokemon world with creatures of stadium-filling scale. The transformation is temporary and location-specific, tied to the energy that flows through Galar's earth from Eternatus at its core. But while it lasts, the encounter with a Gigantamaxed Pokemon is a confrontation with scale itself, with the reality that some forces in the world can only be engaged with through preparation and coalition rather than individual strength. The max raid battles that make Dynamax encounters available to groups of trainers simultaneously describe a model of challenge that requires cooperation, a recognition that certain things in the world are simply too large for any single person to address alone. Terastallization in Paldea, the most recent of these signature mechanics, describes a transformation of elemental expression rather than size or energy intensity. A Pokemon's Terra type is the crystalline identity it expresses when terastallized, and that identity may or may not match its ordinary type in ways that create strategic possibilities of considerable complexity. But beyond the competitive implications, the visual language of terastallization, the way affected Pokemon appear to have been transfigured into living gemstone, connects them to the deep geological history of the region in a way that makes the mechanic feel embedded in the world's actual history rather than imposed upon it. The crystals of Area Zero are the origin point. The terrestrial phenomenon that trainers use daily is the surface expression of what those crystals contain. The world's history is in the ground, and the culture that develops above it is shaped by what rises up from below. The concept of Pokemon friendship, the variable that tracks the depth of the relationship between a trainer and a specific Pokemon, is one of the franchise's most persistently significant mechanics, even when its effects are not immediately visible. A Pokemon with high friendship will occasionally endure a hit that should have knocked it out, finding some reserve of determination that a less connected Pokemon would not access. It will heal from status conditions more quickly. It will land critical hits slightly more often. These effects are not dramatic or decisive in most situations. They are the mechanical expression of something that operates beneath the level of the visible, a quality of connection that the world recognizes and responds to even when it cannot be directly observed or quantified. The friendship variable is also the condition for several of the franchise's most emotionally resonant evolutionary transformations. The evolution of Golbat into Crobat, requiring a friendship level that the game does not specify but that trainers learn to recognize through subtle behavioral cues, describes a development that happens in the background of a journey rather than at a designated milestone. You do not level Golbat to a specific number and watch it evolve. You care for it, travel with it, heal it, and eventually a transformation occurs, because the relationship has reached a point that the biology has been waiting for. The difference between a Golbat that evolves and one that does not is not in any single significant event. It is in the accumulation of ordinary moments of continued care. The Pokemon following mechanics, available in certain games and regions, make this accumulative relationship visible in a different way. A Pokemon that walks beside its trainer, rather than remaining in a Pokeball, expresses its individual personality through its behavior in the overworld, pausing to examine interesting objects, responding to weather conditions, reacting to the music playing in different areas. The world around the walking Pokemon is experienced differently by both of them than it would be with the Pokemon stored in its ball. The trainer is not moving through the world with a resource. They are moving through it with a companion who is also looking at things, also noticing things, also building a relationship with the territory they are both passing through together. The Pokemon Amy and Pokemon Refresh systems introduced in later games take the care relationship even more explicitly into the space of direct physical affection. Feeding, petting, playing, responding to the Pokemon's moods and preferences, as expressed through the interface of the touchscreen or motion controls, these activities do not change the Pokemon in any dramatic sense, but they establish, through the mechanics themselves, that the franchise believes the relationship between a trainer and their Pokemon is something that includes moments of uncomplicated tenderness rather than consisting entirely of preparation and performance. The best care relationships contain both. The training and the battles and the strategic development exist alongside the simpler moments of just being present with a creature that is glad you are there. The Pokemon camp introduced in Galar expanded this care space into a shared environment in which the player's entire party could interact with each other and with the trainer simultaneously, revealing through their interactions something about the relationships that exist not only between trainer and Pokemon, but among the Pokemon themselves. A party of 6 Pokemon is not 6 separate relationships between trainer and individual. It is a small community with its own internal dynamics and friendships and hierarchies, and the camp mechanic makes those dynamics visible in a way that no previous game had quite attempted. Watching a Gengar and a Togekiss interact in a camp environment produces a small story about 2 creatures with very different natures finding a way to exist in the same space, and that story is one that the franchise generates for its players endlessly, without ever quite marking it as the significant thing that it is. The curries made at Pokemon Camp, each with different effects on the Pokemon that eat them, connect the practice of cooking as an act of care to the competitive and developmental systems of the game in a way that is both practically functional and thematically coherent. Making food for your Pokemon, attending to what they enjoy and what restores them, is a form of the same attention that the whole training tradition is built on. The world notices how you treat the living things in your care. The world responds to that treatment in ways that are not always immediately visible, but that accumulate over time into the quality of the relationships you are carrying forward. The various professors who anchor each generation's narrative as sources of knowledge and beginning, from Professor Oak in Kanto through Professor Sada and Turo in Paldea, describe an intellectual tradition that has been maintained and developed across the full span of the franchise's timeline. Each professor represents a particular area of emphasis, a specific facet of the question of what Pokemon are and how they should be understood. Professor Elm's research into breeding and egg groups contributed to an understanding of biological continuity across Pokemon species. Professor Birch's field research methodology, which took him out of the laboratory and into direct encounters with wild Pokemon, produced a different quality of knowledge than laboratory study could have provided. Professor Juniper's focus on the origins of Pokemon, the question of where they came from in the first place, points toward the deepest layer of inquiry in the franchise's intellectual tradition. The starter Pokemon each professor provides are not random choices. They reflect the professor's own priorities and research emphases, the knowledge and care that has gone into preparing those specific three Pokemon to be given to trainers beginning their journeys. Professor Oak, whose research focuses on the relationships between Pokemon and people, offers starters whose evolutionary lines describe three different approaches to that relationship: the quiet loyalty of Bulbasaur, the fierce independence of Charmander, the playful trust of Squirtle. Professor Birch, whose field research gives him an unusually direct knowledge of the Hoenn environment, provides starters whose evolutionary arcs reflect the region's specific ecological character: the warm water world of Mudkip, the high-speed aerial world of Trico, and the volcanic energy of Torchic. These choices are made from knowledge, from a deep familiarity with what the world contains and what the region's beginning trainers will need to engage with it meaningfully. The research tradition these professors represent is not purely academic. It has practical consequences for the world's health and for the quality of the relationships between people and Pokemon at every level. The information gathered by generations of Pokédex holders, synthesized and refined by the professors who receive those entries, contributes to a body of knowledge that makes better care, more informed relationship, and more effective conservation possible. A world in which the creatures that inhabit it are understood is a world in which they can be protected. A world in which their biology is studied with genuine curiosity and care is a world in which their needs can be met more fully. The professor's work is not separate from the training tradition. It is the intellectual foundation that makes the training tradition meaningful rather than simply powerful. The Pokédex entries written by researchers across multiple generations sometimes describe behaviors and capacities that the games themselves never directly show in their mechanics. A Pokemon described in its entries as capable of sensing the emotions of everyone in a 2-mile radius may not have any mechanic that expresses this capacity in the turn-based battle system. A Pokemon whose entry describes it as appearing only to those facing death may not have any in-game trigger tied to that condition. These discrepancies between the Pokédex's descriptions and the game's mechanics are not errors. They are an invitation, a suggestion that the world is larger than what the game's systems can capture, that the creatures exist in a fullness that any representation of them is necessarily partial. The oldest Pokédex entries, preserved in the remakes and updated versions of earlier games, carry the texture of their era and the quality of their prose and the specificity of their observations. Later entries sometimes contradict earlier ones, offering revised understandings of the same creature that reflect new research rather than simply different opinions. This revision of knowledge is not presented as failure. It is presented as the natural condition of any ongoing inquiry into a complex and living subject. The world of Pokemon is not already understood. It is being understood continuously by researchers whose questions are as important as their answers and whose methods shape what they are able to discover. The complete picture of the Pokemon world's timeline, laid out in this full and unhurried survey, reveals something that is easy to miss when any single generation is taken in isolation. The world has a direction. It moves forward from the formless void before Arceus to the extraordinary complexity of the present. And it carries within it the entire weight of everything that has happened along the way. Every region that has been explored adds something to that weight, some new understanding of what the world contains and how its parts relate to each other. Every generation's legendary structure adds a new set of relationships to the cosmic architecture. Every new mechanic, every new evolutionary possibility, every new form of the trainer-Pokemon relationship extends the range of what this world can express. The franchise's willingness to return to and revise its own history, to look at places and events and creatures from new perspectives, and discover that they contain more than their initial presentation suggested, is one of its most distinctive and valuable qualities. Hisui showed that Sinnoh's present was Hisui's future, that the region the games had described for years had a past whose details transformed the understanding of everything built on top of them. The Alolan forms showed that Kanto's familiar species were more variable than decades of encounters had suggested, that the apparent fixity of a Pokemon's nature was actually a kind of local stability dependent on conditions that other conditions could transform. The revisitations to Kanto and Johto that later games made possible showed those regions, as they had continued to develop, their people older, their landscape changed in small ways. Their Pokemon present and different in ways that time makes inevitable. The towns and cities of the Pokemon world have personalities that accumulate across the full span of repeated visits. Pallet Town, the smallest and quietest of all the franchise's starting locations, carries within its two houses and single laboratory an outsized weight of symbolic importance. It is the place where everything began, not once, but each time a new player picks up the game and steps outside for the first time. The grass at its northern edge is famous before it is encountered, known to contain exactly the kind of random encounters that the entire tradition of Pokemon is built around. The lab where Professor Oak waits with three Pokeball choices on a single table is not architecturally impressive, but it is historically significant in a way that no amount of later grandeur can diminish. The tradition of what follows from that lab has shaped the entire world. Celadon City in Kanto introduces the department store as a cultural institution, a place where the material goods of the training world are organized and made available through commerce. The game corner attached to it and the hidden passages beneath it leading to a Team Rocket hideout describe a city with layers, a surface of commerce and recreation, concealing a depth of criminal activity that the player eventually has to descend through. This layering is one of the franchise's consistent architectural metaphors. The idea that beneath the visible surface of ordinary life there are systems and activities and histories that most residents of a city prefer not to examine too closely. Celadon is the first place the games make this explicit, and it remains one of the clearest expressions of it. Lavender Town's Pokemon Tower, a multi-story graveyard for Pokemon whose markings are maintained by the people of the town with a quiet dignity that speaks to a long tradition of respect for the dead, is one of the most unusual locations in the franchise for the simple reason that it is neither a gym, nor a dungeon, nor a research facility. It is a cemetery, and the primary activity it calls for is not battle but presence, a willingness to move through spaces of memorial without rushing, to read the names on the markers, to understand that the world of Pokemon is also a world where things end and are mourned. The haunting quality that many players associate with Lavender Town. The combination of its music and its subject matter and its narrative function in the Kanto story comes from the way it slows the momentum of the journey rather than advancing it. The tower does not make you stronger in any of the ways that matter mechanically, but it changes something in how the journey feels, and that change is part of the education that Kanto provides. Goldenrod City in Johto represents the most developed urban environment in the early games, a city large enough to have multiple districts, a radio tower, a department store, a gym notable for its maze design, a salon for Pokemon, a name raider, a bike shop, and a game corner, all within a single location that the player can spend considerable time exploring before the story. Requires moving on. The national radio tower that broadcasts across all of Johto carries an authority and a reach that the criminal organizations of the game eventually attempt to exploit, and the defense of that tower becomes one of the central events of the Johto story. The radio infrastructure of Johto, which connects its population across distance through shared broadcast content, is a piece of world building that makes Johto feel more modern and more socially interconnected than Kanto, a region in which the primary communication technologies were still in development. Ecruteak City, the cultural heart of Johto, holds its historical weight visibly. The Burn Tower and the Tin Tower, on opposite sides of the city, define its identity more than any other architectural feature, and the people who maintain the traditional dances and ceremonies associated with the legendary Pokemon of the region do so within a cultural framework that stretches back to the oldest events in the region's history. The elder trainers who populate Ecritique's gym have a quality of studied stillness that reflects the city itself, a deliberate maintenance of connection with something older and deeper than the surrounding world's rapid development. Ecritique does not rush, it remembers. The various routes and wild areas connecting the towns of each region are not simply connective tissue between named locations. They have characters of their own, shaped by the Pokemon populations that inhabit them, and by the seasonal and weather conditions that affect them, and by the specific challenges that traveling through them presents to trainers at different stages of their journeys. Route 210 in Sinnoh, regularly shrouded in fog that limits visibility and that gives the route a quality of uncertainty and concealment not present in clearer areas, is a different kind of challenge from the straightforward obstacle of a particularly tall mountain or a particularly deep water crossing. The fog asks the trainer to proceed through conditions where not everything can be seen, where the familiar landmarks are hidden, where the path forward must be trusted even when it cannot be fully verified. That is both a tactical challenge and, in the way the best Pokemon geography manages to be, a metaphor for something more broadly true. The tall grass that appears as the standard wild Pokemon encounter mechanic across multiple generations is so fundamental to the franchise's experience that it is easy to stop noticing it as a design choice. But it is one of the most consequential choices in the franchise's history, and its eventual replacement with visible Pokemon in the overworld environment in the later games was not simply a technological update, it was a philosophical one. When Pokemon appear in the grass invisibly, the encounter is a surprise, an intrusion of the unpredictable into the forward movement of a journey. When they appear as visible creatures moving through their habitat, the encounter is a choice, a decision to engage with a specific creature in a specific moment. Both models describe something real about how the world works. Some things come to you, whether you seek them or not. Some things you have to approach deliberately. The franchise has eventually found space for both. The trading card game and its relationship to the main series games is not simply a commercial adjacency. The cards describe a visual culture around Pokemon that makes explicit something the games always implied, which is that these creatures are also objects of appreciation, that their forms and the energy they embody are worth rendering in art and presenting to an audience. The illustrators who have worked on the trading cards across their history have produced images of Pokemon that sometimes differ significantly from their official game sprites or three-dimensional models, expressing different moods, different relationships with the environments depicted, different moments in the implied ongoing life of the creature shown. A Gengar depicted in a card illustration in a moonlit forest with an expression that is more mischievous than threatening is not a different Gengar from the one in the game. It is a different moment in the same creature's existence, a moment the card is inviting the viewer to imagine inhabiting. The animated series, which has run parallel to the main series games for decades, describes a version of the Pokemon world that shares its geography and its creatures and many of its characters, but that follows a narrative logic of its own. Ash Ketchum's journey, which proceeded for an extraordinarily long time before reaching its conclusion, was not the linear completion of a training arc in the way that a single game's journey is. It was an exploration of the world through encounter after encounter, through the repeated experience of entering new places and meeting new creatures, and finding that the world was always larger than the last place had suggested. The evolution of Ash's relationship with Pikachu across all of the journeys they took together became the franchise's longest-running portrait of what the trainer-Pokemon bond looks like when sustained and deepened across enormous spans of time rather than resolved in any single climactic moment. The theatrical films produced alongside the animated series often operate at a larger mythological scale than the series itself could sustain continuously, bringing the cosmic forces of the world into direct contact with the ordinary characters of the franchise in ways that temporarily suspend the comfortable rhythms of the regular episodes and ask larger questions. Mewtwo's film, which was the first of these, and which has shaped the franchise's relationship with its own deepest themes ever since, asked whether a being created as a weapon could find a reason to exist outside of the purpose it was created for, whether the capacity to love and to form genuine connection was something that could be built rather than born into. The answer it reached, through significant suffering and through the presence of Ash's extraordinary willingness to simply stand in the way of harm, regardless of the cost to himself, was that the origin of a consciousness does not determine its potential. What Mewtwo was made to be did not define what it could choose to become. The relationship between the franchise's multiple media forms, the games and the cards, and the animated series, and the films and the spin off games, and the books and the merchandise, is not one in which any single form is the primary expression and the others are derivative. Each form tells the story differently, emphasizes different things, reaches different audiences, and contributes something to the collective understanding of what the franchise is. The world of Pokemon has never been contained in any single medium. It has always been larger than any representation of it, and the various representations have been ways of exploring different facets of something that no single facet can fully describe. The relationship between time and the Pokemon world, as expressed through the various temporal mechanics and legendary beings associated with time's management, describes a universe in which the present moment is not simply the product of what happened before it, but also the point at which all possible versions of what could happen next are still undetermined. Dialga's power over time is not simply the ability to replay the past or to preview the future. It is the capacity to understand the present moment as the place where all of time is gathered, the point at which every moment is still accessible if one has the capacity to perceive and navigate temporal dimensionality. The implications of this for how the Pokemon world's history should be understood are significant. The past is not simply gone. It is still present in the structure of Dialga's ongoing existence, still accessible in principle, if not in ordinary practice. Celebi's temporal movements, which are more casual and less cosmically fraught than Dialga's governance, describe a different relationship with time's possibilities. Celebi does not manage time or protect it. It simply moves through it, the way a creature moves through familiar territory, navigating its dimensions as easily as any other creature navigates the three spatial ones. The forests that Celebi tends are forests in multiple temporal states simultaneously, and the health of those forests across their entire history is something that a time-traveling guardian can maintain in a way that no temporally fixed being could. The loss of Celebi from a forest's ecology would be the loss not only of its current presence, but of its oversight across the entire temporal span of that forest's existence. This is an ecological significance of a kind that has no parallel in any other form of nature management, and the Ilex forest's subtle quality of temporal depth, the feeling that it remembers things that no living tree or person could remember, reflects what Celebi's presence means for the places it inhabits. The event triggered mythical Pokemon that became available through distribution events over the years of the franchise's life. Celebi and Jirachi and Deoxys and Mew and the many others describe a dimension of the world that exists outside the games themselves, in the network of player participation and special occasion that the franchise created around its most elusive creatures. The experience of receiving one of these Pokemon through a distribution event was different from the experience of catching any wild Pokemon or completing any in-game quest. It was something given by the world outside the game into the world inside it, a moment of connection between the franchise and its audience that acknowledged the reality of both sides of that relationship rather than pretending that the game world was sealed off from the world the player inhabits. The Pokemon arrived from somewhere outside the fiction, and both the player and the franchise understood that, even as both also understood that within the game's terms, the arrival was treated as a natural event. The ongoing expansion of the Pokédex from the original 151 through every subsequent edition describes a world whose biodiversity was never fully charted by any single generation's effort. Professor Oak's famous admission that there are still many undiscovered Pokemon out there was not simply a hook for future games. It was an honest statement about the condition of knowledge in a world as large and varied as the one the franchise was building. New species continued to be discovered. New forms of known species revealed themselves in unexpected locations. New evolutionary connections between species that appeared unrelated are uncovered through more careful research. The sense that the world is always larger than the current map of it is one of the franchise's most consistent and most generative principles. The thing that makes each new generation's discovery of its own regional dex feel like a genuine expansion of understanding rather than simply an addition to a fixed catalog. The number of individual Pokemon species now available across all generations is large enough that the question of what it would mean to have encountered all of them, to have some relationship with each one, is no longer a straightforward matter of completion in the way that the original 151 suggested. A trainer who has caught every species in every generation has not thereby known every Pokemon. They have met them, briefly, in the specific context of a capture encounter, which is the beginning of relationship rather than its fulfillment. The franchise has always understood this distinction, even as it has built its completion mechanics around the act of catching. What is being completed in a completed Pokédex is not a survey of relationships. It is a catalog of encounters, a record of every type of meeting the world has made available. The relationships are something else entirely, ongoing, particular, irreducible to any entry in any list. The question of what it means to be a trainer in the Pokemon world, rather than some other kind of person, is one that the games rarely address directly, but that their narrative choices continuously illuminate. In every game, the player character begins their journey with no particular status, no accumulated power, no special relationship with the world's established hierarchies of skill and recognition. They are simply someone who is beginning, which is also the condition of every genuine journey. The transformations that occur over the course of each game, the development of skill and connection and accumulated experience, happen through the ordinary processes of engagement with the world rather than through any inherited advantage or external gift of power. The player character earns what they achieve, and what they achieve is a function of how they engaged with what was available to them rather than what they were given. The rivals who accompany each generation's journey, whether they are friendly competitors or genuine antagonists or something more complicated in between, are part of what makes the player character's development visible. Without the rival, the growth would still be happening, but would have no measure, no external reference point, no relationship within which its quality could be tested and understood. The rival is not simply an obstacle or an enemy, they are a mirror, reflecting the player character's progress back to them in a form that can be compared, challenged, and ultimately transcended. The moment of surpassing the rival is not a defeat in the ordinary sense. It is a recognition, a validation, that what has been built through the journey is genuinely something. The final confrontation with a champion, the moment toward which every gym badge and every training session and every late-night encounter in tall grass has been pointed, is one that different games have treated with very different emotional registers. Some champion battles are quiet and personal, happening in spaces whose architecture reflects the weight of what is occurring. Others are spectacular, surrounded by the symbolism of the region's history and mythology. But all of them share the quality of a rival, of a journey that has been moving towards something finally reaching what it was moving toward. The champion is not simply the strongest trainer in the region, they are the person who has already been where the player is about to go, who knows what the journey makes you, who can recognize in the player the same qualities that the journey made in them. The battle is recognition as much as competition, and its conclusion, whatever the result, is an acknowledgement that the journey produced exactly what it was meant to produce. The moment after the champion battle, When the Hall of Fame is entered and the credits roll and the world continues into its post-game content, describes something about the Pokemon world's relationship with completion that is unusual in video game terms. The journey does not end when the League is conquered. The League is simply a milestone, and the world that exists beyond it is the world that the journey was preparing the player to inhabit. The post-game content, the additional legendaries, the additional challenges, the deeper explorations of the region's mythology and history are not bonus content in the sense of something extra and optional. They are the full expression of a world that had more in it than the main narrative required the player to engage with. The world was always complete. The player's access to it was graduated by the journey. The music of each region is not incidental to the experience of being there. The composers who have created Pokemon game music across the franchise's history have consistently found ways to encode the emotional character of each location into its accompanying sound, so that returning to a familiar area is an experience that works on the auditory memory as much as on the visual one. The Lavender Town music that became famous for its unsettling quality was not unsettling by accident. It was composed specifically to create the emotional register appropriate to a town built around commemoration of the dead, and its effectiveness in doing so is a testament to the craft of its creation. The cycling road music that encourages the speed of movement through an open elevated terrain is different in almost every quality from the mystery, tinged exploration music of a sealed dungeon, and both of these are different from the warm, familiar repetitions of a professor's laboratory or the triumphant fanfare that follows a successful battle. The world is sounded as well as seen, and the quality of that sound is part of what makes each location what it is. The trainer encounters scattered across every route describe a social dimension of the Pokemon world that is easy to move through quickly, but that rewards attention. Each trainer has a brief script, a line or two of dialogue that places them in the world, that gives them a context and a motivation and a personality expressed in the few words they have available to them. The school kids who want to practice their recently learned Pokemon skills, the fishermen who prefer to spend their time by the water, the scientists conducting field research in unusual terrain, the couples who travel together, the elderly trainers whose Pokemon have been with them for many years, the ace trainers whose pride in their skill is evident in every word they say. Each of these brief encounters is a glimpse into a complete life in which Pokemon are present as naturally and as consequentially as anything else. The world is full of people for whom this relationship is not an extraordinary adventure, but simply the ordinary texture of existence, and their presence makes the player character's journey feel embedded in a real social world rather than floating free of it. What remains across all of the generations, and all of the regions, and all of the stories, and all of the encounters, and all of the moments of connection between people and Pokemon that the franchise has produced is a sense of something larger than any of its individual components. The Pokemon world is not great because of any single game, or any single generation, or any single legendary, or any single relationship. It is great because of the accumulation, the way that each edition has found its place within what already existed and extended it in directions that felt both surprising and exactly right. The world that Arceus assembled from the void has been assembled again and again and again by the people who made these games and by the people who played them, each of them adding something to the picture, each of them finding in it something that the picture was waiting to give. The quiet shadows of what was lost along the way, the designs that almost made it, the stories that were started and not finished, the connections that were implied but never made explicit, are part of the picture too. They are the space between the visible elements, the silence between the notes, the darkness that gives the light its depth. The Pokemon world is complete in the way that any living thing is complete, not by containing everything, but by being coherent, by having a character that persists through every version of itself, and that is recognizable across every change it has undergone. The concept of types in the Pokemon world is not simply a combat mechanic. It is a taxonomy of elemental affinity, a way of understanding how different creatures relate to the fundamental forces and materials that make up the world around them. A fire-type Pokemon is not merely one that uses fire attacks. It is a creature whose biology and personality and relationship with its environment is organized around the qualities of fire, warmth, transformation, the ability to consume and renew, the danger and the comfort of something that provides light and heat, but that can also spread beyond any boundary if it is not tended with care. Understanding a fire type Pokemon means understanding fire itself, the way it behaves, the conditions it needs, the things it does to the things around it. The electric type describes a set of creatures whose existence is organized around the movement of charged particles, around the spark and the current, and the discharge, around the quality of energy that moves through a conductor faster than any physical object can move through space. The relationship between electric type Pokemon and technology in every region that has developed significant electrical infrastructure is not accidental. Where human technology has learned to harness electrical energy, electric type Pokemon are found nearby, in generators and substations, and places where the energy they embody finds an environment that resonates with what they are. The power plant in Kanto, the Valley Windworks in Sinnoh, the various industrial facilities across the regions, all attract electric type presence in a way that reflects the deep alignment between what those creatures are and what those locations contain. The ice type describes creatures whose existence is organized around the transformation of matter through the removal of heat, around the stillness and preservation that extreme cold produces, around the quality of things held in suspension rather than allowed to change. Ice-type Pokemon are most often found in the elevated, cold, and remote places of each region, locations that are difficult to reach and that present particular challenges to trainers who are not prepared for their conditions. The beauty of ice as a visual and tactile phenomenon is present in the designs of these creatures, and their association with beauty that is also harsh and unforgiving is one of the most consistent type-specific aesthetic themes in the franchise. The Dark type, introduced in Generation 2 to address specific competitive balance concerns, took on additional philosophical significance in the way it was designed and named in its Japanese form, where it is called the Evil type, though this translation does not quite capture the concept. Dark type Pokemon are not simply evil or malevolent. They are creatures associated with strategies and qualities that conventional honor systems regard with suspicion, deception, opportunism, the willingness to strike when an opponent is distracted, the use of methods that might be effective but that a certain kind of ethical framework would find dishonorable. The Dark type is the type of the pragmatist, the strategist who does not accept the constraints that tradition imposes on how one achieves one's goals. Whether that pragmatism is virtuous or not depends, in the franchise's logic, entirely on the goals it serves. That is the complete picture of the Pokemon world's full timeline, gathered from its deepest mythological origins through every generation's contribution to the present moment. May it have given you something worth carrying into sleep tonight. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.